We turn our attention to the Dalmatian coast in the spring of 1358, as Venetian banners are said to be lowered from the walls of Ragusa. You are standing on the limestone cliffs above the Adriatic, where the city of Ragusa clings to a rocky promontory jutting into the sea. It is the year 1358. The last Venetian governor is said to have departed through the Pile Gate, and the nobles reportedly gathered in the rector's palace to swear an oath of collective rule. For the next 450 years, this tiny walled republic between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian lagoon preserved its independence largely through diplomacy, trade, and the careful rotation of power among its merchant families. The harbour at Ragusa breathes with the first grey light of a March morning, and you are standing at the water's edge where the fishing boats have already begun to part the still surface of the Adriatic. The Creek of Orlox carries across the narrow channel between the mainland and the small island of Lorsa, that older settlement now called Lave, where the earliest inhabitants had gathered first walls against the sea. Around you, the stone of the quay holds the night's cold in its pale cast body, and the smell of salt and cypress drifts from the water to mingle with wood smoke rising from the harbour's eastern edge, where the bakers have begun their day's work before the sun has fully cleared the eastern hills. You watch as a man in a dark cloak moves past you toward the arsenal, his footsteps ringing once and then absorbed by the worn limestone, and you understand that this is no ordinary morning in the life of the city that the Venetians have called Ragusa for 2 centuries of suzerainty. The Roman name Ragusium, later adapted to Ragusa in Italian and German usage, reflects the city's long history of foreign influence and rule by powers whose banners flew from these walls rather than those of the local people who built them. Yet today, by the terms of the Treaty of Zadar, concluded earlier that year, that dominion has ended, and the assembled populace waits in the main square for the visible sign of this transformation. The pale gold light of early morning moves across the terracotta roofs of the old city, touching first the highest points, and then sliding down toward the water like a hand descending a staircase. And you follow the man in the dark, cloak through narrow streets where the houses lean together overhead, creating corridors of shadow that still hold the darkness of the hours before dawn. Merchants are already stirring in the ground floor chambers, their voices low and careful, speaking of cargoes and commissions in the Italian that has become the language of record, even as the Slavic name Dubrovnik, derived from Dubrava meaning oak grove, moves in parallel use among the wider population since the early years of the 15th century that has not yet arrived. You are walking in a city that contains multiple names, multiple histories, multiple futures pressing against each other like the stones of its walls. The main square opens before you as you emerge from the final street, and the scale of the gathering takes your breath in a slow, quiet inhalation that matches the breathing of the city itself. Perhaps 7,000 inhabitants live within these walls at the height of the Republic that is only now being born, and a significant portion of them stand in the open space before the rector's palace, which would be begun in the 15th century by architects including Onofrio della Cava and Giorgio da Sebenico, though in 1358 its walls are only beginning to rise from the foundations of something older and more provisional. The palace will one day combine late Gothic and early Renaissance architectural elements, but now you see it as a work in progress, its stone fresh and pale, its courtyard still unroofed in places where the sky shows through like a promise. The crowd murmurs with the sound of many voices kept deliberately low, a sea of sound without distinct words, and you position yourself where you can see both the palace facade and the wall above the Pile Gate, where the Venetian standards have flown since before most of those present were born. The Latin name Communitas Ragusina has described this gathering of citizens in the documents of the previous decades, but already in the minds of those who have negotiated the Treaty of Zadar, another form is taking shape. Republica Ragusina, the Ragusan Republic, a body politic that will sustain itself through centuries of precarious independence. By 1472, the official Italian designation will become Repubblica di Ragusa, but the substance of that title is being forged in rituals like these. A figure emerges onto the balcony of the palace, and the murmur of the crowd subsides into a silence so complete that you can hear the limestone chisels against the pale cast rock, where workmen continue to extend the walls despite the significance of the hour. The defensive system will eventually stretch approximately 2 kilometers and is considered among the best preserved medieval defensive systems in Europe, though the men with their chisels know only that they must work while the light holds and the stone yields to their patience. That recognition lies 6 centuries beyond the comprehension of anyone breathing this morning air. The figure on the balcony speaks in Latin, the language of law and church and Venetian administration, but the words he speaks are words of severance rather than submission. He announces that the Treaty of Zadar has been ratified, that the Hungarian kingdom under Louis I extended its influence along the eastern Adriatic, and that Ragusa's freedom in 1358 came not through military victory, but through diplomatic maneuvering between greater powers, with the city beginning to construct the institutional framework that would sustain its republic for centuries. You feel the words move through the crowd like a wave, touching each listener with a different weight of meaning, and you understand that the surrounding territory under Ragusa's control, limited to a narrow coastal strip and a few islands, will demand of this small population an ingenuity of governance that larger states might never develop. The standards come down from the wall above the pile gate, and the assembled populace witnesses the lowering with a silence that persists for several long moments before giving way to a sound that is not quite sheer, not quite release, but something more complex and more enduring. You watch the fabric descend, the Lion of St. Mark disappearing from view behind the parapet, and you notice how the pale gold light catches the dust disturbed by the movement, turning the air itself momentarily luminous. The smell of salt and cypress returns on a breeze from the harbor, and with it the creak of oarlocks as more fishing boats depart before dawn, their crews having waited only to see this moment before resuming the ancient rhythms of sustenance. The cool interior of the rector's palace awaits, its stone floors worn smooth by centuries of ceremonial footsteps, though in this year of transformation, those centuries are still largely ahead of it. You move with the crowd toward the entrance, passing through doorways where the shadow falls across your face like water, and you find yourself in a chamber where the first gathering of the Grand Council is assembling to establish the principle that no single man would rule. The Latin name Communitas Ragusina echoes in the documents being unrolled on the central table, and the Republica Ragusina takes shape in the voices of men who understand that their city's survival depends on institutions rather than personalities. The sealing of the new constitution occupies the hours that follow, the document written in Latin and Italian preserving the forms of republican governance that the Venetian model had provided, but transforming them into something native, something responsive to the particular pressures of this place. You watch as the wax receives the impress of multiple seals, as the scribes copy the text onto sheets that will be dispersed through the city and beyond, announcing to the world that a new entity has entered the community of states. The dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers will follow within days, announcing Ragusa's new status as a free commune to those who must be persuaded to respect what diplomacy has created. The surrounding territory under Ragusa's control limited to a narrow coastal strip and a few islands, means that these ambassadors carry an argument rather than a threat. And you sense in the careful wording of their instructions the recognition that the city-state's independence was first won not through military victory, but through diplomatic maneuvering between greater powers, and that only continued diplomatic maneuvering will preserve it. The Hungarian kingdom under Louis I extends its influence along the eastern Adriatic, but Hungary is not Venice, and the space that opens between these greater entities is the space in which Ragusa must learn to breathe and trade and survive. The afternoon finds you on the walls where the workmen continue their labor, the sound of limestone chisels now accompanied by the longer shadows of a sun descending toward the western sea. The beginning of wall construction and reinforcement turns the city into a fortress of diplomacy rather than war, and you understand that these stones are an argument made visible, an assertion that the Republic's population, small though it remains with the city itself, numbering perhaps 7,000 inhabitants at its height, intends to control its own destiny. The walls rise stone by stone, season by season, and the men who place them know that they build for grandchildren they may never meet. The pale gold light of early morning has long since passed into the amber of afternoon, and now you watch it deepen toward the rose and violet of evening, the terracotta roofs of the old city glowing as if from internal heat before cooling into the blue of dusk. The smell of salt and cypress from the Adriatic mingles with wood smoke from the harbor in proportions that shift with the wind, and the creak of oarlocks returns as the fishing boats come home with their catch, their hulls low in the water, their crews silent with the exhaustion of labor. You are standing at the harbor as the first stars appear above the island of Lorsa, where the original settlement stood before expanding to the mainland. The Roman name Rausium, later Ragusium, gave rise to the Italian and German form Ragusa, and the Slavic name Dubrovnik, derived from Dubrava meaning oak grove, had been in parallel use since the 15th century, though that century is still decades distant from the moment you inhabit. The cool interior of the rector's palace calls you back through streets now lit by torches and by the lamps that merchants place in their windows to signal continued commerce. The stone floors receive your own footsteps as you enter, and you find the Grand Council still in session, the Latin and Italian of their deliberations rising and falling like the breathing of some great organism. The sealing of the new constitution has occurred, but the work of implementation continues through the night, and you observe as the dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers is prepared, the documents announcing Ragusa's new status as a free commune being folded into leather cases for the journey. The Hungarian kingdom under Louis I has extended its influence along the eastern Adriatic, and the ambassadors must navigate among interests that do not naturally align with Ragusan survival. Yet the Treaty of Zadar has created a space, and the city immediately began constructing the institutional framework that would sustain its republic for centuries, and you are present at the first articulation of that framework's daily operation. The night deepens, and the sound of limestone chisels has ceased with the darkness, though the stones placed today remain visible in the starlight as you return to the walls for a final survey. The city walls will become the best-preserved medieval defensive system in Europe, and Ragusa will be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979 for its remarkable urban fabric. But those recognitions are dreams within dreams from the perspective of 1358. What you see now is the outline of possibility, the physical manifestation of a freedom won not by arms, but by the patient accumulation of argument and alliance. The pale gold light of early morning will come again to the terracotta roofs of the old city, and with it, another day of labor and deliberation and the slow construction of a republic. The creak of oarlocks in the harbour will greet the fishing boats as they depart before dawn, and the smell of salt and cypress from the Adriatic will mingle with wood smoke from the harbour in the familiar pattern that defines this place. You are standing at the harbour at dawn once more, though the dawn you await is still hours distant, and the cold air moves across your face with the gentleness of a hand that asks nothing but presence. The surrounding territory under Ragusa's control remains limited to a narrow coastal strip and a few islands, and the Republic's population remains small, with the city itself numbering perhaps 7,000 inhabitants at its height. Yet the first gathering of the Grand Council in the Rector's Palace has established the principle that no single man would rule, and the sealing of the new constitution, written in Latin and Italian, has preserved the forms of republican governance that will outlast many more powerful states. The dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers, announcing Ragusa's new status as a free commune, has set in motion relationships that will require constant tending, constant recalibration, constant vigilance against the entropy that threatens all human arrangements. The cool interior of the Rector's Palace receives you once more, and the stone floors seem to hold in their substance the accumulated weight of the day's transformations. The Latin name Communitas Ragusina has yielded to Republica Ragusina in the documents now being stored in the palace archives, and by 1472, the official Italian designation will become Republica di Ragusa, though that future refinement matters less than the substance of what has been declared. The Rector's Palace, begun in the 15th century and designed by architects including Onofrio della Cava and Giorgio da Sebenico, will combine late Gothic and early Renaissance architectural elements. But its true architecture is the architecture of governance, the distribution of voice and decision across a population that refuses the concentration of power. The night is very old now, and the stars have shifted their positions above the island of Lorsa, that older settlement now called Lave, where the original inhabitants had gathered before expanding to the mainland. You find yourself in a small chamber of the palace, a single lamp burning low on a table where a scribe still works, his pen moving with the steady rhythm of a man who knows that the records he creates will outlast his own memory. The sound of limestone chisels will resume with the dawn, and the city walls will continue their slow expansion. The Treaty of Zadar has ended decades of foreign domination, and the city immediately began constructing the institutional framework that would sustain its republic for centuries. The lamp flickers, and the scribe pauses to trim the wick, and you feel the pause extend into something longer, something that resembles the threshold between waking and sleep. The pale gold light of early morning is still distant, but the memory of it lingers in your senses, the terracotta roofs of the old city still warm in your inward vision. The creak of oarlocks in the harbour has ceased, the fishing boats at rest, until the next departure before dawn, and the smell of salt and cypress from the Adriatic mingles with wood, smoke from the harbour, in proportions that suggest the deepest hour of the night, the hour when even the vigilant allow their attention to soften. The cool interior of the Rector's Palace surrounds you, and the stone floors seem to hold a temperature that belongs to no single season, a constancy that the world outside cannot offer. The first gathering of the Grand Council has concluded its initial session, and the sealing of the new constitution has been accomplished, and the dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers has been prepared for the morning's departure. The scribe resumes his work, and the pen moves with a sound like water over stone, and you feel your own attention settling into the rhythm of that movement, the long, gentle, declarative pace of a night that has witnessed transformation, and now settles into the ordinary labor of making transformation endure. The cold air moves across your face where a window has been opened to admit the night, and the smell of salt and cypress enters with it, mingling with the wood smoke that rises from the last embers of the palace hearth. The sound of limestone chisels is still hours from resuming, and the pale gold light of early morning on the terracotta roofs belongs to a future that approaches with the inevitability of celestial motion. You are standing in a doorway of the rector's palace, and the stone of the archway holds the coolness of many such nights, many such dawns, many such passages between the darkness of uncertainty and the light of another day's work. The assembled populace in the main square has long since dispersed to their homes, and the lowering of Venetian standards from the city walls in 1358 has entered the realm of memory and soon of legend, the kind of story that grandfathers will tell to children who cannot imagine a time when the lion flew above their city. The Latin name, Communitas Ragusina, has become Republica Ragusina in the documents, and by 1472, the official Italian designation will become Republica di Ragusa, and the Slavic name Dubrovnik, derived from Dubrava meaning oak grove, will continue its parallel use since the 15th century, a double naming that reflects the double consciousness of a people who have learned to speak in multiple registers, to claim multiple identities, to survive through the flexibility that their narrow territory and small population demand. The creak of oarlocks returns, faint and distant, a single boat moving in the harbor for purposes you do not know and do not need to know. The cold air moves across your face again, and you feel the weight of the palace around you, the weight of the walls that rise and will continue to rise, the weight of the institutions that have been declared and must now be lived into being. The surrounding territory under Ragusa's control is limited to a narrow coastal strip and a few islands, and the Republic's population remains small, with the city itself numbering perhaps 7,000 inhabitants at its height. But the space of freedom is measured not in hectares or in census figures, but in the capacity of a people to determine the conditions of their own existence. The lamp in the scribe's chamber gutters and steadies, and the pen continues its movement, and you feel your own consciousness settling like sediment in clear water, the events of the day sorting themselves into layers of significance that will only fully reveal themselves in the years to come. The stone of the archway against your shoulder holds the temperature of the earth itself, beneath the fluctuations of weather and season, beneath the history that passes across its surface, like the pale gold light of early morning passing across the terracotta roofs of the old city. The cool interior of the rector's palace receives you as you move away from the doorway, and the stone floors seem to hold in their polished surfaces the reflection of many such nights, many such passages between one condition and another. The first gathering of the Grand Council has established the principle that no single man would rule, and the sealing of the new constitution has preserved the forms of republican governance, and the dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers has prepared the ground on which future negotiations will occur. The pen stops, and the scribe lifts his head, and for a moment your eyes meet across the lamplight with an acknowledgement that requires no words, the recognition of two people who have witnessed something that cannot be fully spoken, something that belongs to the realm of collective experience and collective memory. The cold air moves across your face once more, and you realize that a window has been opened somewhere, or that you have moved to a place where the night enters more freely. The creak of oarlocks has ceased, and the harbor holds its stillness with the patience of water that has witnessed many such nights, many such transformations, many such moments when human choice intersects with the larger movements of power and history. The pale gold light of early morning is closer now, though still below the horizon, and you can feel its approach in the subtle shift of temperature, the faint brightening of the eastern sky that the senses register before the mind can name. Yet the first gathering of the Grand Council has established the principle that no single man would rule, and the sealing of the new constitution has preserved the forms of republican governance, and the dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers has set in motion the relationships that will require tending through the generations. The city-state's independence was first won not through military victory, but through diplomatic maneuvering between greater powers, and only continued diplomatic maneuvering will preserve it. The stone of the palace breathes around you, and the cool interior holds you with the gentleness of a hand that asks nothing but presence, nothing but the willingness to remain, to witness, to allow the night to complete its passage into day. The sound of limestone chisels will come again, and the pale gold light of early morning will move across the terracotta roofs of the old city, and the creak of oarlocks will greet the fishing boats as they depart before dawn. The smell of salt and cypress from the Adriatic will mingle with wood smoke from the harbor, and the cold air will move across your face with the persistence of a sea that knows no master, that recognizes no sovereignty but its own eternal motion. You are standing in the rector's palace, begun in the 15th century and designed by architects including Onofrio della Cava and Giorgio da Sebenico, and the stone floors receive your weight with the patience of matter that has learned to outlast the urgency of human desire. The Latin name, Communitas Ragusina, has become Republica Ragusina, and by 1472, the official Italian designation will become Republica di Ragusa, and the Slavic name Dubrovnik, derived from Dubrava meaning oak grove, will continue its parallel use since the 15th century. The cool interior of the rector's palace seems to deepen its coolness in response to the approaching dawn, as if the stone itself inhaled in preparation for the warmth to come. The first gathering of the Grand Council has concluded, and the sealing of the new constitution has been accomplished, and the dispatch of ambassadors to neighboring powers awaits only the light to begin its journey. The pale gold light of early morning touches the highest terracotta roofs of the old city, and you feel it in your face as you move toward an eastern window of the palace, the cold air moving with you, the smell of salt and cypress entering with the light. The creak of oarlocks returns in earnest now, many boats moving in the harbor, the fishing fleet departing before dawn as it has departed on countless mornings, and will depart on countless more. The ancient rhythm of sustenance and survival that underlies all political transformation, all constitutional innovation, all the grand declarations of human purpose. The stone floors hold the first warmth of the day, and the cool interior of the rector's palace begins its daily transition from night to day, from darkness to light, from the privacy of deliberation to the public labor of implementation. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though you do not remember moving from the palace, and the fishing boats are small against the widening light, their oars dipping and rising with the rhythm that has shaped this place, since before the Roman name Rausium, later Ragusium, gave rise to the Italian and German form Ragusa. The assembled populace in the main square has dispersed to their homes and their work, and the lowering of Venetian standards from the city walls in 1358 has entered memory, and the new day begins with the ordinary extraordinariness that sustains all human endeavor, the fishing boats departing and the chisels waiting, and the Republic continuing its long negotiation with the world that surrounds it. The Senate of Equals, a republic without a king. You are standing in the palace courtyard as the first light of October touches the eastern parapet, and the echo of footsteps follows a procession of noblemen in crimson robes who move across the flagstones toward the great council hall. Around you, the merchants of the city are already at their stalls in the marketplace beyond the walls, but within these precincts, the business of the Republic unfolds with deliberate ceremony, and the rector, Ornez, will today swear his oath before the assembled nobility for a term of only 1 month to prevent any accumulation of personal power. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the scent of autumn from the hills above the harbour, and you watch as the elected man, his name spoken softly among the crowd as Marin Gondola, kneels before the altar where the relics of Saint Blaise rest in their silver case. The flicker of oil lamps in the council chamber during evening sessions has given way to morning sun through the high windows, and the noblemen gather in their ranks, their families represented by generations of recorded service in the books that lie open on the lectern. The Great Council, or Concilium Maius, formed the supreme legislative body, restricted to male members of approved noble families, and its members stand now in their prescribed places, the older men leaning slightly upon their staffs of office, while the younger watch with the contained patience of those who know their own eligibility depends upon the continuation of this exact order. You feel the texture of the ancient wall beside you, the limestone worn smooth by centuries of similar gatherings, and the taste of bitter local wine served during ceremonial functions still lingers faintly upon your tongue from the previous evening's vigil. Marin Gondola rises from his knees, and the oath rolls through Latin phrases that bind him to the Republic's service, and the rector was required to remain within the palace for the duration of his term, separated from his family, a requirement that now settles upon him with visible weight as he accepts the seal of his temporary office. The assembled nobility murmur their assent, and the ceremony concludes not with celebration, but with the quiet dispersal of men who understand that power distributed is power preserved, and the serrata, or closing of the Great Council, occurred in 1332, formally restricting membership to existing noble families, a closure now so complete that the names of the eligible echo through every decision made within these walls. You remain in the courtyard as the echo of footsteps, where the rector paces during his month of confinement, begins already to mark the rhythm of his isolation. The afternoon finds you in the upper gallery of the rector's palace, where the rector's private apartments, administrative offices, and the great council hall all connect through corridors of polished stone. The palace was repeatedly damaged and renovated from the 15th century through the 19th century, and the present fabric shows this history in its layers. Gothic arches beside Baroque doorways, a Renaissance fireplace in a room whose ceiling still bears the smoke stains of some long-ago disaster. You are standing at the window of the rector's private chamber as Marin Gondola enters for his first evening alone, and the distant sound of the city watch calling the hours from the walls drifts upward with the regularity of a mechanical heart. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the harbour below, their voices faint and disconnected, and the cold air moves across your face through the opened casement. The rector's first night in the palace, alone, contemplating the weight of temporary authority, unfolds in the silence that follows the withdrawal of his attendants. You observe from the shadowed doorway as he moves to the desk where correspondence awaits his signature, then turns away to pace the narrow length of his apartment. The flicker of oil lamps in the council chamber below sends faint shadows through the floorboards, and he pauses to listen, perhaps imagining the continuing business of the Republic proceeding without his participation in the smaller Senate, or Concilium Rogatorum, which handled day-to-day governance and foreign policy. The archives of the Republic, preserved in the palace, contain thousands of diplomatic letters and trade agreements, and their presence surrounds him like whispered counsel from every previous holder of this constrained dignity. The taste of bitter local wine has been replaced in his chamber by simple water and bread, for the rector's salary was deliberately modest, emphasizing service to the Republic rather than personal gain. And even the furnishings of his apartment reflect this principle of restrained display. You feel the texture of the woolen coverlet upon the narrow bed, and the rustle of parchment as scribes copy diplomatic correspondence in the chancery reaches him from the floor below, a continuous murmur of administrative life. The echo of footsteps in the palace courtyard seems to follow his own movement as he turns again at the window, and the distant sound of the city watch calling the hours marks the passage of his first night in this voluntary imprisonment. Dawn comes with grey light through the harbour mist, and you find yourself in the Senate chamber where a smaller gathering convenes for the urgent business of grain prices. A heated debate, conducted in Italian, Latin, and the local Slavic dialect, fills the room with overlapping cadences, each language carrying its own weight of legal precedent and practical concern. The flicker of oil lamps has given way to morning clarity, yet the lamps remain lit against the autumn gloom, and their smoke rises toward the painted ceiling where the personification of justice holds her scales. Around you, the merchants of the city press their case through appointed representatives, for they themselves may not speak in this chamber, and the cold air moves across your face from the open door as messengers arrive with fresh reports from the warehouses. The noble families debate with the contained ferocity of men who have known each other since childhood, their alliances and enmities worn smooth by constant negotiation. This aristocratic constitution has been compared to Venice's own system, though on a far smaller scale, and the comparison rises unspoken in the chamber's architecture, its raised platform for the presiding officer, its arrangement of benches facing inward toward the space of confrontation. The rustle of parchment in the chancery provides a continuous undertone to the spoken arguments, and you feel the texture of the marble bench where you sit among the silent observers, the stone absorbing the heat of your body slowly, indifferently. The distant sound of the city watch calling the hours intrudes briefly as a senator from the Bona family rises to challenge the proposed price ceiling, his Latin formal and exact. The taste of bitter local wine appears now in the small cups that attendants circulate, a permitted indulgence to sustain the debaters through their prolonged deliberation. Elections involved multiple rounds of voting using a complex system of balls and urns to prevent corruption, and this same attention to procedural purity governs the present debate, each speaker recognized in strict rotation, each motion seconded according to prescribed forms. The Council of 40, or Quarantia, served as a judicial body overseeing commercial disputes, and its members sit among the senators today, their presence a reminder that price and law intertwine in this republic of traders. You are standing at the rear of the chamber as the argument shifts to the local Slavic dialect, the senators from the older families preferring its rough directness for matters of practical urgency. The echo of footsteps in the palace courtyard reaches the chamber occasionally as Marin Gondola takes his exercise. Excluded by his very office from participation in this debate, he is sworn to execute. A repaired crack in the chamber's western wall admits a draught that stirs the lamps. The flicker of oil lamps will resume this evening if the debate continues, as seems likely, and you observe the senators' faces in the uncertain light, the lines of age and calculation equally distributed among them. The decision emerges not through acclamation, but through the slow accumulation of modified positions, each concession recorded by the scribes whose continuous labor produces the rustle of parchment in the chancery. Noble families were carefully vetted. New families could only be admitted through a complex process requiring unanimous consent, and this same exclusivity shapes the Senate's confidence in its own authority, its willingness to impose upon the wider populace. The taste of bitter local wine sustains those who have partaken, But the Republic's austerity extends even to this, the cups measured and few. The rejection of a petition from a wealthy merchant family seeking admission to the nobility occupies the Senate on the following day, and you are standing among the petitioner supporters in the anteroom as the decision reaches you in fragments, carried by the departing senators, whose faces confirm the outcome before their words. The family in question, the Krijvik, prosperous in the dye trade across 3 generations, had presented their case with elaborate documentation, their wealth demonstrated through warehouse inventories and ship manifests, their loyalty through service in the Republic's naval expeditions. Yet the Serrata, now 2 centuries past, retains its absolute force, the very mention of amendment considered a breach of the Republic's fundamental settlement. The echo of footsteps in the palace courtyard accompanies your own withdrawal from the anteroom, and the cold air moves across your face as you emerge into the open space where Marin Gondola walks with measured stride, his isolation now a visible emblem of the system's self-denial. Around you, the merchants of the city conduct their business in the knowledge that certain thresholds remain uncrossable, and the flicker of oil lamps in the council chamber will tonight illuminate further deliberations from which they remain excluded. The archives of the Republic contain thousands of diplomatic letters and trade agreements, and among them now resides the Krijvik petition, its refusal recorded in the formal language of perpetual exclusion. You feel the texture of the petitioner's disappointment in the slumped shoulders of the family representative who descends the palace steps before you, his fine clothing suddenly theatrical in its inappropriateness to the occasion. The Great Council's composition, defended through this refusal, preserves a world in which birth outweighs achievement in the distribution of political power. The taste of bitter local wine will not comfort the rejected petitioners, for the Republic's ceremonies admit only those already within its circle. The door through which you re-enter bears the marks of some long-ago assault upon this ordered world, its iron studs hammered flat where perhaps a rival power sought entry. The rector served a term of only 1 month to prevent any accumulation of personal power, and Marin Gondola's figure receding into the palace's interior demonstrates this principle in human form, his temporary dignity, already half consumed by the calendar's relentless progression. You are standing in the corridor that connects the administrative offices, and the cold air moves across your face from the sea-facing windows, carrying the sound of waves against the harbor wall. The annual audit of public accounts, conducted with painstaking thoroughness by rotating committees, occupies the Republic in the weeks that follow, and you find yourself in the chamber where 3 members of the Quarantia examine the records of the customs office, their fingers tracing each entry in the massive ledgers. The Council of 40's extension into financial oversight reflects the Republic's understanding that corruption follows opportunity as surely as tide follows moon. You feel the texture of the audit's severity in the committee's refusal to accept verbal explanation where documentary proof is lacking, their insistence upon tracing each transaction to its origin in witnessed contract. Public officials were prohibited from accepting gifts from foreign powers, and this prohibition extends into the examination of customs records, the auditors searching for anomalies that might indicate concealed payment. The taste of bitter local wine appears in the small refreshment offered to the committee at midday, its very bitterness a reminder of the Republic's chosen austerity. You are standing at the window as the afternoon light shifts across the harbor, and the cold air moves across your face with the promise of winter's approach. The system succeeded in preventing both tyranny and popular revolution for over 4 centuries, and this success manifests in the auditor's calm certainty that their work matters, that the Republic's continuation depends upon such unglamorous vigilance. The rector's salary was deliberately modest, emphasizing service to the Republic rather than personal gain, and the customs records reveal similar modesty in the compensation of lesser officials, their accounts balanced with the precision of those who understand that privilege carries obligation. Around you, the merchants of the city calculate their own profits against the known rates of taxation, their acceptance of this order implicit in their continued participation. The flicker of oil lamps will soon replace the failing daylight, and you observe the auditor's final entries for the day, their signatures appended with the flourishes of men practiced in the formalities of public trust. The rector's palace contained the rector's private apartments, administrative offices, and the great council hall, and you move through these connected spaces as evening settles, each chamber assuming its nocturnal character in the gradual withdrawal of official presence. The echo of footsteps in the palace courtyard has ceased now. Marin Gondola perhaps already abed in preparation for tomorrow's concluding ceremonies, his separation from family unrelieved even in these final days. You are standing in the great council hall where the great council will tomorrow convene to elect his successor, the process beginning anew with the same elaborate precautions against corruption. The rustle of parchment in the chancery continues below, the Republic's memory extending itself through this nightly labor, and the archives contain thousands of diplomatic letters and trade agreements that constitute the written foundation of this enduring order. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargo still, or perhaps loading now, the tide having turned, the rhythm of their labor indifferent to the palace's ceremonies. The taste of bitter local wine lingers in the emptied cups that attendants have gathered from the auditor's chamber, and you feel the texture of the great council hall's silence, its capacity for contained speech awaiting tomorrow's filling. The smaller Senate, or Concilium Rogatorum, handled day-to-day governance and foreign policy, and its benches stand empty beneath their canopy, the Republic's continuous life suspended in this interval between one rector and the next. The flicker of oil lamps sends its last illumination through the doorway as you depart, and the cold air moves across your face in the corridor's draught. The serrata, now distant in years, maintains its absolute force in the Republic's present arrangements, the very concept of opening unthinkable to those formed within its limits. Around you, the merchants of the city close their accounts for the day, their figures moving through the streets toward the gates that separate the harbor from the residential quarters, and the rustle of parchment in the chancery reaches you faintly as the palace's last active labor. You feel the texture of the harbor wall beneath your hands, its limestone rougher than the palace's polished interior, more exposed to weather and use. The archives contain thousands of diplomatic letters and trade agreements, and their accumulated mass represents the Republic's continuous negotiation with a wider world that knows nothing of its internal constraints, its deliberate distribution of authority. The taste of bitter local wine seems to rise from memory as you stand there, the body's recollection of formal occasions blending with the present moment's sensory actuality. The cold air moves across your face with the harbor's particular quality, salt and fish, and the distant vegetation of the hills combined in a single inhalation. You are standing as the last light leaves the western sky, and the flicker of oil lamps has given way to darkness in the unoccupied spaces, the palace's active life contracting toward the scribe's chamber and the rector's isolated apartment. Around you, the merchants of the city have reached their homes, the harbor's activity suspended until dawn, and the cold air moves across your face with the night's increasing chill. The great council's members sleep now in their family houses, their eligibility for tomorrow's deliberation unthought, assumed, as natural as breathing. The Council of 40 served as a judicial body overseeing commercial disputes, and its members too rest in preparation for the continuing business of oversight and judgment. The rustle of parchment in the chancery may continue yet, some final letter requiring completion before the morrow's dispatch, and you pause to listen for this evidence of unceasing labor. The taste of bitter local wine has entirely faded now, replaced by the neutral moisture of the harbor air, and you feel the texture of exhaustion in your own limbs, the long day's observation demanding its physical recognition. You move through the outer precincts toward the gate that separates this concentrated center from the wider city's ordinary life. The flicker of oil lamps has entirely ceased now, and the darkness of the unlit spaces reaches toward you as you find the gate. The echo of footsteps in the palace courtyard follows you into the street beyond, the memory of Marin Gondola's measured solitude persisting as you move through the sleeping city. Around you, the merchants of the city sleep in their houses, their dreams perhaps occupied with the calculations of trade, the risks of shipment, the fluctuations of price that constitute their daily concern. The cold air moves across your face with the approach of morning, and you feel the texture of the Republic's continuing life, its success in preventing both tyranny and popular revolution for over 4 centuries manifested in this ordinary night of peaceful passage. The Serrata, the closing of the Great Council, occurred in 1332, formally restricting membership to existing noble families, and this closure, now distant in years, maintains its absolute force in the Republic's present arrangements, the very concept of opening unthinkable to those formed within its limits. The rector, or Nez, served his term of only 1 month to prevent any accumulation of personal power, and tomorrow's ceremony will repeat this limitation with the same formal precision, the same collective determination that no individual shall dominate this ordered commonwealth. The morning mist clings to the harbor at Ragusa, where you stand among the silent warehouses as dawn begins to dissolve the darkness over the Adriatic. The water holds the color of brushed steel, and the first gulls turn above the masts with wings outstretched in patient circles. Around you, the merchants are gathering in small groups, their voices kept low in the hour before the city's full awakening, and the cold air moves across your face with the faint salt memory of distant storms. The Serrata, or closing of the Great Council, occurred in 1332, formally restricting the political life of the Republic to those ancient families whose names filled the registers, and from that narrowing had emerged this strange freedom, the liberty to pay 2 masters and belong to neither. From the late 15th century, Ragusa paid annual tribute to the Ottoman Empire to secure its autonomy, and this payment, regular as the turning of tides, became the foundation upon which all other arrangements rested. The tribute was negotiated as a payment for protection rather than submission, preserving Ragusan legal independence in a form that satisfied the Sultan's dignity while leaving the Republic's laws intact. You watch as clerks emerge from the customs house, their ledgers bound in leather that has darkened with decades of handling, and the heavy scent of frankincense in the palace chapel during masses for successful diplomacy still lingers in your imagination from yesterday's observance. The silver intended for Constantinople has been weighed and recorded through the night, each bar stamped with the marks that would identify its origin to Ottoman treasury officials. The clatter of hooves on stone as the tribute caravan departs through the pile gate will sound before noon, and already the pack animals are being led from their stables, their coats brushed to a dull gleam in the half-light. Ottoman control of the Balkan interior made Ragusa's tribute essential for overland trade routes that connected the warehouses now surrounding you with the markets of Belgrade, Sofia, and beyond. And without this passage, the silks and spices that filled the Republic's coffers would have traveled by longer, more dangerous paths. The city maintained simultaneous diplomatic relations with the Habsburg monarchy and other Christian powers, a balancing performed with the precision of a rope walker above depths that none cared to measure too exactly. The sound of the Adriatic surf against the rocks below the walls, constant through all negotiations, provides an undertone to every calculation made in the council chambers above. You move through the narrow streets as the sky pales toward full morning, and the texture of worn limestone passes beneath your fingertips where you trail them along the building's faces. Shutters open above you in sequence, revealing glimpses of interior warmth against the lingering chill, and the smell of baking bread begins to compete with the harbor's brine. Ragusan merchants received trading privileges within the Ottoman Empire that many European states lacked, and these privileges, renewed through careful diplomacy generation after generation, allowed the Republic's ships to enter ports where Venetian banners would have been turned away. The Ottoman Empire controlled the vertical trade route from Damascus through Bursa to the Adriatic by approximately 1400, and this corridor, maintained through conquest and administration, terminated in the warehouses where you now pause to observe the loading. Bundles of goods marked for Ottoman destinations are being sorted with the methodical patience that characterizes all preparations for long journey, and the clerk's murmured notations create a counter-rhythm to the creaking of ropes and the shifting of cargo. Ragusa's diplomatic corps included permanent representatives in Constantinople from the 16th century, men who learned the languages and customs of the sublime port well enough to navigate its complexities without the constant recourse to interpreters that hampered less prepared embassies. The oppressive heat of a Constantinople summer, felt by Ragusan ambassadors in their formal robes, lies months in the future for the embassy now assembling, yet the memory of it shapes their preparations for the journey. You observe a senior merchant directing the placement of a particularly heavy chest, his gestures economical and precise, and the taste of Turkish coffee, newly fashionable, served in the rector's private chambers, recalls itself to your awareness as if the dark liquid had just passed your own lips. The city-state's flag bore the word Libertas, proclaiming its freedom despite the annual tribute, and this declaration, embroidered in gold thread upon crimson silk, accompanied the tribute embassy as both statement and shield. Ragusan ships were permitted to trade in Ottoman ports under the empire's protection, a concession that transformed the Republic's modest fleet into an instrument of disproportionate commercial influence. The Republic avoided participation in Christian crusades against the Ottomans, maintaining strict neutrality even when papal legates pressed for commitment, and this abstention, though it drew criticism from some quarters, preserved the trading relationships upon which the city's prosperity depended. The annual departure of the tribute embassy from the harbor, its cargo of silver carefully recorded, proceeds with ceremonial gravity as the sun clears the eastern hills and gilds the water. You find yourself among the small crowd that has gathered to witness the embarkation, your position on the quay affording a clear view of the vessel that will carry the embassy across the winter sea. The captain stands at the rail, his beard grizzled with years of these passages, and the sails, though still furled, show the repairs and replacements that mark a working ship rather than a display piece. This policy of balanced tribute and trade was maintained from the late 1400s until the empire's weakening in the 18th century, and within that span, the Republic learned to read the Ottoman court's moods as farmers read weather signs, adjusting their approaches to the seasons of imperial favor or neglect. The Ottoman sultans valued Ragusa as a useful intermediary with Christian Europe, a channel through which messages might pass when direct communication would have compromised dignity or exposed weakness. Ragusan merchants acted as commercial agents for Ottoman goods reaching Western markets, their networks of correspondence and credit extending from the Bosphorus to the exchange halls of London and Amsterdam. You feel the warmth of the strengthening sun upon your shoulders as the last of the cargo is secured and the ambassador himself appears, his robes of office dark against the brightening sky, and the ceremony of departure unfolds with the measured pace of long tradition. The city's archives contain extensive correspondence with Ottoman provincial governors and imperial officials, records that document the endless negotiation of practical matters. The price of passage, the resolution of disputes, the confirmation of privileges for merchants stranded by war or weather. The tribute amount was periodically renegotiated, sometimes reduced during periods of Ottoman financial difficulty, when the Sultan's treasury found advantage in securing steady payment over maximum extraction. And these fluctuations, carefully tracked in the Republic's records, reveal the mutual calculation that underlay the apparent hierarchy of tribute. The streets narrow as you climb, the buildings pressing closer in the medieval pattern that conservation rather than expansion has preserved, and the shadows retain their morning coolness in passages where sunlight arrives only at midday. The rector's palace awaits above, its facade displaying the accumulated architectural gestures of centuries, and you pass through the courtyard where the taste of Turkish coffee, newly fashionable, has become a daily ritual rather than exotic novelty. The audience of Ragusan ambassadors with the Ottoman Grand Vizier, conducted through interpreters in multiple languages, will occur weeks hence in chambers where the heat rises from marble floors, and the conversations move through Arabic, Turkish, Italian, and the diplomats shared Latin with the deliberate complexity of a formal dance. The heavy scent of frankincense in the palace chapel during masses for successful diplomacy reaches you now as you pass the chapel's closed door, the residue of yesterday's prayers for the embassy's safe passage still hanging in the still air. You do not enter, but the awareness of those prayers, offered in the knowledge that their object lies beyond human certainty, accompanies your continued ascent. The clatter of hooves on stone has begun below, the sound carrying upward through the city's acoustical channels with a clarity that belies the distance, and you imagine the procession winding through the gate and onto the coastal road that leads toward the Ottoman frontier. The secret arrival of a Habsburg envoy, smuggled into the rector's palace through a side entrance, occurred in darkness 3 nights past, and the knowledge of this visit, held among the narrowest council, informs the deliberations now proceeding in chambers you will not enter. The envoy travelled in the guise of a merchant from Trieste, his papers prepared with the meticulous care that such deceptions demand, and his mission, though its precise contents remain known only to the rector and his closest advisers, concerns the shifting alignments that the Ottoman advance along the Dalmatian coast has forced upon all parties. You stand in an upper gallery, the stone balustrade cool beneath your palms, and observe the harbour now spread below with the tribute ship diminished by perspective to a toy upon the water. The oppressive heat of a Constantinople summer will greet these travellers if they survive the winter passage, and the contrast between this present chill and that anticipated warmth marks the geographical and political distance the Republic navigates. Among the archive documents are letters from previous embassies describing the conditions of service, the fevers, the intricate court ceremonies, the long waits for audiences that might be cancelled without explanation. You descend now through passages that avoid the main stairs, your route chosen for the views it affords through narrow windows of the city's layered fabric. Gardens hidden behind walls, workshops where the sound of metal on metal speaks of armament preparation, domestic spaces where laundry dries in the morning, air with the patient domesticity that persists through all political calculation. The heavy scent of frankincense mingles in your awareness with the sharper smells of the street-level world, and the composite speaks to the Republic's characteristic combination of sacred aspiration and practical necessity. The secret arrival of a Habsburg envoy has set in motion consultations that will continue for weeks, the pace of decision deliberately measured to allow consideration of implications that extend far beyond the immediate moment. You find yourself in the palace's lower rooms, where the temperature drops with the depth below ground level, and the walls weep moisture that has been collected and channeled since the building's construction. The taste of Turkish coffee has preceded you here in the form of empty cups being returned to kitchens, the dark residue at their bottoms marking the hours of discussion already consumed. The clatter of hooves on stone fades as the procession moves beyond the city's immediate acoustic reach, and the relative silence that follows feels less like absence than like the held breath between movements of a composition. You emerge from the palace's lower levels into a courtyard where citrus trees in terracotta containers have been arranged to catch the morning light, their dark leaves glossy with the moisture of recent watering, and the fruit, though not yet ripe, shows the swelling that promises autumn harvest. You stand among the citrus trees, your shadow falling across the gravel with the elongated proportions of morning, and the warmth of the sun, now fully risen, begins to displace the chill that has accompanied your passage through the palace's depths. The oppressive heat of a Constantinople, summer seems distant indeed from this mild morning, yet the connection between this place and that, maintained through the annual embassies and the permanent representatives, creates a web of association that transcends immediate sensation. You find a bench placed for the contemplation of the courtyard's composition, and the stone, though cold, accepts your weight with the patient indifference of material that has supported generations of similar pauses. The heavy scent of frankincense rises in your memory as you sit, the sensory marker of a faith that found expression in prayers for worldly success, rather than in the renunciation that some of its teachers advocated. You rise from the bench as the morning advances, the shadows shortening toward their noon contraction, and the courtyard's geometry reveals itself more clearly in the higher light. Ragusan merchants appear to have acted as commercial agents for Ottoman goods reaching Western markets, and this function, performed with accumulated expertise over generations, likely made the Republic important to commercial networks that extended far beyond its modest territorial extent. You pass from the courtyard into a corridor that leads toward the council chambers, your movement unhurried, and the temperature shifts with the change of exposure from warm to cool and back again as you progress. The taste of Turkish coffee has preceded you here as well, the aroma hanging in the air of the antechamber where junior officials await their summons. The clatter of hooves on stone has long since ceased, the procession now miles along the coastal road, yet the awareness of its departure informs the council's deliberations as context informs any specific moment. The tense council debate when news arrives of Ottoman armies approaching the Adriatic coast will not occur today, but the memory of previous such moments, preserved in the archives and in the living memory of senior members, shapes the present discussion of how to respond to the Habsburg overture. You do not enter the council chamber itself, your presence in this narrative maintained at the edges of decision-making, where observation exceeds participation, but the quality of the sounds that reach you, voices raised in argument, then deliberately lowered. The scrape of chairs, the rustle of documents, conveys the character of the proceedings. The heavy scent of frankincense seems, in your present location, to belong to another world. Yet the chapel's proximity to the council chambers suggests the integration of sacred and secular that the Republic's practice assumed. The oppressive heat of a Constantinople summer will greet the present embassy if it survives the winter passage, and the council's deliberations include consideration of how to prepare the ambassador for the particular challenges of the current Ottoman court. You move away from the council chamber's vicinity, your footsteps echoing in the corridor's acoustical properties, and the relative quiet that follows allows the other sounds of the palace to emerge. The distant clatter of kitchen preparation, the irregular rhythm of a cistern's drip, the passage of some official on business, similar to your own inscrutable purpose. The secret arrival of a Habsburg envoy remains known to few, and your knowledge of it in this narrative represents a privilege of perspective rather than historical typicality. The trace of hooves in the road's dust, visible from the palace's upper windows, gradually effaces by wind and subsequent traffic, marking the embassy's departure with the ephemeral monumentality that characterizes all human movement through space. You find yourself in the palace's upper gallery, the harbor visible through arched openings with the tribute ship now a distant speck upon the water's expanse, and the quality of light here, filtered through the gallery's protective screening, creates patterns upon the floor that shift with the sun's movement. The city-state's flag reportedly bore the word Libertas, proclaiming its freedom despite the annual tribute, and this proclamation, however paradoxical it might appear to external observers, represented what some sources describe as the Republic's foundational self-understanding. The taste of Turkish coffee has become associated in your present awareness with the Council's deliberations, the beverage's bitter complexity offering an analogue to the political calculations it accompanies. You remain in the upper gallery as the morning advances toward noon, the light shifting from the warm tones of early day to the clearer illumination of midday, and the harbor's activity continues below with the rhythm that commerce imposes upon maritime space. The heavy scent of frankincense will rise again this evening, when the council's present session concludes and thanksgiving is offered for whatever decisions emerge. This policy of balanced tribute and trade was reportedly maintained from the late 1400s until the empire's weakening in the 18th century, and if sustained across generations and through vast changes in the surrounding world, it may suggest the adaptability that the Republic's narrow social structure paradoxically encouraged. The clatter of hooves has long since ceased, yet the road the caravan followed remains visible from your vantage, a ribbon of lighter color against the darker terrain through which it passes. Ragusan merchants acted as commercial intermediaries with Christian Europe, and the preservation of this value required that the Republic avoid commitments that would have compromised its usefulness to either side of the confessional and political divide. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, where the great carrack San Giovanni Battista rides at anchor, her hull freshly caulked with oakum and tar that releases its pungent aroma into the salt morning air. Around you, merchants unload cargoes from smaller vessels that have come alongside during the night, their voices carrying across the water in the Ragusan dialect of Dalmatian Italian that serves as the commercial language of the elite. The cold air moves across your face as you watch the stevedores prepare the holds for the outbound journey, their movements practiced and deliberate in the half-light. The particular silence of the counting house, broken only by the scratch of quills on ledger paper, will not arrive for several hours yet, when the day's transactions have concluded and the senior partners gather to record them. For now, the visual chaos of the quayside dominates your attention, crates and bales in dozens of languages and colors, stacked in precarious arrangements that somehow never collapse. A barrel of Cretan wine rolls past your position, its curved staves catching the first direct rays of sunlight that have cleared the ridge behind the city. The Ragusan merchant houses established permanent agencies in cities from London to Alexandria, and the network they constructed depended upon moments such as this, when a single vessel might carry the accumulated hopes of multiple partnerships across uncertain seas. The asterisk, San Giovanni Battista asterisk, will depart for England with wine and return with wool, completing a circuit that has remained profitable for 3 generations of the gondola family, whose agents supervise the loading. You observe the mate chalking figures on a slate, his hand moving with the confidence of one who has made this calculation hundreds of times before. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread eaten by sailors before departure lingers in your imagination, though you yourself have not joined their company. It is enough to witness their preparations, the small rituals of separation that precede any voyage of significance. The Republic's fleet consisted primarily of merchant vessels rather than warships, a deliberate choice that reflected the priorities of a state whose power resided in negotiation rather than confrontation. Ragusan ships carried goods between Ottoman ports and Western European markets, threading through political waters that remained navigable only because the Republic's neutrality allowed its ships to trade in wartime when vessels of belligerent powers were excluded. This morning, that neutrality manifests as an absence of naval ensigns that might identify the vessel with any cause beyond commerce itself. The creak of scales in the customs house as salt is weighed and taxed provides a rhythmic counterpoint to the shouts of the dockworkers, a mechanical regularity that speaks of centuries of accumulated procedure. You move through the crowd toward this sound, passing beneath an archway where the stonework has been worn smooth by generations of shoulders brushing against it in passage. The city maintained a staple port system, requiring certain goods to be unloaded and offered for sale locally, and this morning's salt consignment from the pans of Ston must pass through official measurement before any portion of it may continue onward. Yet here in the customs house, you hear the Ragusan dialect mingling with Turkish, Greek, and the various Italianate patois of the Adriatic coast, a linguistic commerce that mirrors the material exchange it facilitates. A clerk calls out figures that are recorded by his colleague, the sequence of numbers establishing a provisional truth that will be contested and verified in the hours to come. The smell of oakum and tar from ships under repair in the harbor returns to your notice as the wind shifts, carrying with it the particular sweetness of heated pine resin used in the corking process. Somewhere beyond your field of vision, a merchant son is departing for apprenticeship in a Constantinople counting house, his trunk already aboard a smaller coaster that will make the passage eastward in company with other vessels for mutual protection. Merchant families intermarried across the Adriatic, creating networks of trust and credit that extended far beyond any individual's capacity for personal knowledge. And this young man's placement represents the activation of one such connection, a gondola cousin married to a family with established ties in the Ottoman capital. You do not see his departure, but you sense it as a diminution in the crowd, a space where anticipation had concentrated and now disperses. The visual chaos of the quayside continues without apparent alteration, yet the composition of its human elements shifts continuously, each departure and arrival reconfiguring the whole. Ragusan colonies existed in major trading cities, including Venice, Ancona, and Constantinople, and these settlements functioned as extensions of the Republic's commercial intelligence, gathering information that would shape decisions made in the counting houses of the home port. The particular silence of the counting house seems almost to reach forward through the morning's activity, a promise of order that will be imposed upon the day's accumulated disorder. You find yourself at the water's edge, where the limestone has been worn into smooth undulations by centuries of vessels grounding against it at low tide. The cold air moves across your face with a persistence that suggests the weather is turning, the first hints of an autumnal change that will make the outbound passage more demanding than the summer crossings that have preceded it. The return journey of the San Giovanni Battista lies months in the future, beyond the horizon of any present certainty. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread becomes actual rather than imagined as you accept a portion from a vendor whose cart occupies a permanent position near the quayside, his presence as established as any of the stone structures that surround him. His fish has been prepared according to methods that have not changed in the memory of any living inhabitant, the flesh dried and salted until it resembles leather in texture, the flavor concentrated into something that sustains without pleasure. You chew slowly, watching the activity continue around you, the loading of the great carrack, proceeding with a deliberation that belies the urgency whispered among the merchants whose capital is represented in each bale and cask. The merchant marine reached its peak in the 16th century before gradual decline, and though that peak has passed, the remaining traffic still suffices to maintain the appearance of prosperity that is itself a form of commercial necessity. The creak of scales in the customs house resumes after a pause, the rhythm established once more. You hear the Ragusan dialect, now in the elevated tones of a dispute between two agents representing different partnerships, their disagreement concerning the priority of loading for goods consigned to overlapping destinations. Their voices carry the particular intonation of the educated Ragusan, the flattened vowels and extended consonants that mark their origin for any listener familiar with the linguistic geography of the Adriatic. Many merchants also served as diplomats, blurring the line between commerce and statecraft, and the resolution of this dispute will likely involve appeals to relationships that transcend the immediate transaction, obligations of hospitality and godparentage that bind the commercial community into something resembling kinship. You observe without participating, your position at the harbor allowing you to witness without being witnessed, the anonymity of the stranger in a city whose life depends upon the continual arrival and departure of strangers. The smell of oakum and tar intensifies as you move toward the vessel that will carry the merchant's son toward his apprenticeship, her hull supported by timbers that have been driven into the mud of the harbor bottom at angles calculated to distribute her weight. Around you, merchants continue unloading cargoes from vessels that have arrived during the night, their movements creating patterns that seem random from close observation, yet resolve into coherence when viewed from sufficient distance. The city specialized in transshipping goods from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic world, and this specialization required the maintenance of facilities for storage, repair, and reconsignment that constituted a significant portion of the Republic's physical plant. The visual chaos of the quayside represents not disorder, but a higher order accessible only to those who have learned to read its syntax, the position of each item indicating its origin, destination, and the urgency of its handling. The cold air moves across your face with renewed strength as the sun ascends toward its midday position, the warmth insufficient to overcome the maritime chill that will persist until the true summer arrives. You are standing at the harbor where the great carrack San Giovanni Battista rides at anchor, her loading now substantially complete, the hold filled with the sweet weight of Dalmatian wine that will find its market in the taverns and private cellars of London and Bristol. The particular silence of the counting house awaits the conclusion of this physical labor, the translation of material into numerical representation that constitutes the true commerce of the merchant elite. Ragusan insurance contracts and bills of exchange have been preserved in archives across Europe, and the instruments that will be drawn to cover this voyage already exist in draft form, their clauses specifying the hazards against which the underwriters have agreed to indemnify the owners. The creak of scales in the customs house has ceased entirely now. The morning's assessment complete, the officials dispersed to their midday meal. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread remains in your mouth, the salt persisting longer than the other flavors, a mineral reminder of the sea that surrounds and defines this place. You move away from the immediate quayside, following a street that ascends in gradual stages toward the center of the city, the sound of maritime activity diminishing behind you as the architecture closes in, the buildings leaning toward one another across narrow passages that admit only fragments of sky. The prosperity you have witnessed this morning represents the accumulated return on distant investments, the slow accumulation of preference and familiarity that transforms occasional transactions into enduring relationships. The arrival of news that a Ragusan ship has been lost to Barbary corsairs reaches the city on an afternoon when the light has turned golden, the quality of illumination suggesting a distance from the events it reveals, as though disaster were always occurring elsewhere, in a light unlike that which surrounds the recipient of intelligence. You are standing in a courtyard where merchants have gathered for the customary exchange of information that precedes the evening meal, their faces shifting through expressions of concern and calculation as the details emerge. A vessel outbound from Ancona, laden with silver and manufactured goods from across Europe, has been taken off the coast of Barbary, her crew likely to be sold into slavery or held for ransom according to the practices of the region. The Republic's neutrality allowed its ships to trade in wartime when vessels of belligerent powers were excluded, but that neutrality offered no protection against predators who recognized no sovereign authority, whose operations constituted a parallel economy of violence that intersected with legitimate commerce at unpredictable points. The particular silence of the counting house will be shattered tomorrow when the partners of the affected house gather to assess their exposure. But for now, the courtyard fills with the murmur of voices, exchanging speculation and condolence in proportions that shift according to each speaker's relationship with the loss. You observe the faces around you, the gradual transition from shock to the beginnings of strategic response, the commercial mind reasserting its dominance over the merely human reaction to misfortune. The visual chaos of the quayside has not diminished in the hours since your morning observation, yet you perceive it now as more fragile, the accumulated wealth subject to confiscation by forces that acknowledge no right of property beyond their own capacity for seizure. The cold air moves across your face as evening approaches, the temperature dropping more rapidly than it rose, the maritime climate asserting its variability. You understand that the insurance claim that follows will occupy months of correspondence, the assessment of value requiring verification against records maintained in multiple locations, the negotiation of settlement involving the same networks of personal relationship that structure all significant commerce in this world. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread acquires a different significance in light of this news, the ordinary provisions of voyagers now shadowed by awareness that similar meals may have constituted the final sustenance of those now enslaved or drowned. The creak of scales in the customs house continues its mechanical rhythm, the administrative routine persisting without reference to individual disaster, the Republic's requirements for revenue undiminished by private loss. The Ragusan dialect serves to conduct the preliminary discussions of response in this courtyard, the formulation of collective position that will be presented to the authorities and to the underwriters whose obligations have now been triggered. You remain in the courtyard as the light fails, the golden quality of afternoon replaced by the blue of early evening, the first stars becoming visible in the portions of sky visible above the surrounding roofs. Around you, merchants continue unloading cargoes from the vessels that have arrived during the day, the routine continuing despite the news, the necessity of commerce overriding the inclination to mourn. The smell of oakum and tar returns on the evening breeze, the ordinary persisting alongside the extraordinary, the preparation for future voyages continuing despite awareness of the hazards they entail. The annual balancing of a major merchant house's books, conducted by candlelight over several nights, begins on an evening when the moon has not yet risen, the darkness complete enough to make the candle flames seem to occupy spaces of their own definition, separate from the architecture that contains them. You are standing in the doorway of the counting house, observing the preparations for this ritual that will occupy the senior partners until the dawn hours of multiple successive days. The books that will be balanced tonight contain entries originating in cities from London to Alexandria, the translation of distant transactions into the common language of double-entry bookkeeping that permits their aggregation and assessment. The cold air moves across your face as you enter, the interior temperature little different from that outside, the candles providing more illumination than warmth. You observe the arrangement of materials on the long table that dominates the room, the ledger stacked in order of seniority, the ink prepared to consistency specified by tradition, the quills selected for their capacity to hold sufficient fluid for extended passages without requiring replenishment. The visual chaos of the quayside has its counterpart here in the ordered array of numerical records, each figure representing a material reality now distant in time and space, the abstraction of commerce achieving its purest form. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread seems to linger in the atmosphere of the counting house, the bodily experience of voyage translated into the numerical record of its costs and returns, the separation of labor and capital accomplished in the columns of the ledger. You move to a position against the wall, your presence tolerated as that of an observer whose role requires no explanation, the concentration of the participants too intense to accommodate curiosity about your identity or purpose. The creak of scales in the customs house seems to echo from the morning's activity, the auditory memory persisting into this different domain, the connection between physical and financial measurement more than metaphorical. The first partner begins to read aloud, his voice low but clear, the figures emerging into the candlelit air where they seem to acquire temporary substance before dissipating into the cumulative total. The Ragusan dialect serves as the commercial language of the elite, and its cadences structure the reading, the specialized terminology marking this as a discourse inaccessible to those outside the commercial community. The particular silence of the counting house establishes itself as the dominant condition, the reading giving way to transcription, the verification of figures against figures in a process that requires sustained attention to detail without the relief of narrative progression. You observe the faces of the partners as they work, the candlelight modeling their features into masks of concentration, the occasional gesture of rubbing eyes or stretching fingers, the only indication of physical presence in a space otherwise dominated by mental labor. The cold air moves across your face from some source you cannot identify, a draft that preserves the temperature of the stone walls against which the building rests, the earth's constancy asserting itself against the temporary warmth of human occupation. The annual balancing will continue beyond your capacity for sustained attention, the process requiring the accumulation of hours that exceeds what any single observation can encompass. You understand that your presence here is itself a form of entry in some unwritten ledger, the witness whose testimony might someday be required to establish what occurred in this room during these hours, the reliability of memory invoked against the possibility that the written record might be disputed or destroyed. The visual chaos of the quayside seems infinitely distant from this ordered interior, yet the connection between them is the very subject of the balancing, the reconciliation of physical and financial reality that commerce perpetually attempts. The taste of preserved fish and hard bread returns to your awareness as a hunger that you had suppressed, the long hours of observation without sustenance now announcing their cost in bodily sensation. You remain against the wall, your shadow shifting as the candles consume themselves and are replaced, the partner's attention never wavering from their task, the accumulation of figures proceeding with a slowness that measures itself against the standard of accuracy rather than that of speed. The decline of Mediterranean trade routes after 1500 gradually reduced Ragusan commercial importance, and the figures that emerge from this balancing will indicate whether that decline has reached the threshold of crisis for this particular house, or whether the accumulated reserves of earlier prosperity suffice to cushion the impact of changed circumstances. The gradual consolidation of smaller houses as profits decline in the 17th century represents the larger context within which this annual balancing acquires its significance. The individual enterprise measured against the trend of its times, the possibility of independent survival weighed against the attractions of merger or absorption. You observe the senior partner as he pauses in his writing, the quill held suspended above the page, as some calculation proceeds internally, his expression revealing nothing of the conclusion toward which it tends. The Ragusan dialect serves for a purpose more immediate than the recording of transactions, the murmured consultation that follows this pause, employing it for the negotiation of interpretation that determines how the figures will be understood and presented. The particular silence of the counting house persists through the deepest hours of the night, the world outside reduced to a darkness that offers no distraction from the task at hand. You find that your attention has drifted, the figures losing their individual significance and merging into a texture of sound rather than meaning, the auditory experience of commerce detached from its content. The smell of oakum and tar has no reality in this hour, the harbour itself dormant, the vessels riding at anchor in attitudes of suspended purpose that mirror the suspended animation of the city around them. The discovery of Atlantic routes to Asia and the Americas further marginalized the city's position, and though this discovery lies in the past, its consequences continue to unfold in the present, the gradual redirection of commercial energies that will the great earthquake of April 6, 1667, arrived without warning on a morning already steeped in sacred observance, the bells of Ragusa calling the faithful to Easter week services as the sun climbed above the eastern Adriatic. You are standing near the Cathedral of Dubrovnik, the Romanesque structure rising before you in pale limestone, its bell tower casting a long shadow across the polished paving stones, where merchants and nobles and servants alike are gathering for the morning liturgy. Around you, the narrow streets of the old town hold the cool air of early spring, the scent of incense still lingering from the previous evening's procession through the steep lanes. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of a city waking into devotion. Footsteps on worn steps, the murmur of greetings exchanged between neighbors, the distant clatter of a shutter opened against the brightening sky. The cathedral stands at the center of this unfolding morning, its facade familiar to every inhabitant of the Republic, its construction the work of generations who understood stone and faith, and the particular quality of light that falls upon this coast. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though the harbour lies some distance below the sacred precinct, and the vessels anchored there await cargoes that will not move today, their masts swaying almost imperceptibly in the offshore breeze. The limestone streets of Ragusa gleam where the early sun strikes them, the pale stone warmed now by centuries of foot traffic, by the passage of solemn processions, and hurried merchants and children racing between the columns of the rector's palace. Around you, the merchants have begun their labor in the harbor below and will not complete it, the rhythm of their work about to be interrupted by forces no merchant can negotiate or trade away. The first tremor arrives at approximately 8:00 in the morning, when the churches are fullest, and the hope of resurrection most present in the minds of the worshippers. You feel it beneath your feet as a strange liquefaction of the familiar, the solid paving stones seeming to breathe, to rise and fall like the deck of a vessel in heavy seas. The cathedral shudders, its towers swaying against the blue sky that moments before had promised only clarity and spring warmth. Dust descends from the high vaults where the congregation has gathered, the Easter week observances interrupted by a sound like thunder from deep within the earth itself. The great earthquake has begun its work upon Ragusa, and the strongest documented earthquake in Dalmatian history will not release the city until thousands lie dead and the fabric of centuries lies in rubble. The destruction unfolds with terrible speed, each moment compounding the last as buildings designed for permanence discover their fragility. You are standing now in the open space before the rector's palace, the structure heavily damaged though not completely destroyed, its elegant loggia cracked and tilting where the earthquake has found the weaknesses in its stonework. The palace that housed the Republic's governance, that witnessed the deliberations of rectors and councils across generations of independence, now sheds its facing stones into the plaza where survivors are already gathering. The earthquake caused fires that burned what the tremors had left standing, and you can see the first tongues of flame licking at the wreckage of a merchant's house, the cooking fires and lamps of mourning kindled into general conflagration by the collapse of hearths and the rupture of oil stores. The smell of dust and lime from collapsed masonry hangs in the air for days, though this first hour concentrates every future hour into its suffocating density. You taste it at the back of your throat, the particular mineral bitterness of pulverized limestone, the ancient mortar reduced to powder that coats every surface and every survivor. The cathedral, that monument to faith and civic pride, has fallen in upon itself. The towers that marked the skyline for centuries, now a jumble of carved stone and shattered timber, and the crushed remains of those who had sought sanctuary within. The earthquake has been estimated at magnitude 7, 0 or greater on modern scales, and the ancient builders of Ragusa, for all their skill in spanning vaults and raising walls against the Mediterranean wind, could not engineer against such motion, such sudden vertical displacement of the very ground beneath their city. The unnatural stillness after the earthquake settles only gradually, broken by distant cries and the rumble of aftershocks that continue to terrorize those who have survived the main shock. You are moving through streets no longer recognizable, the familiar landmarks of a lifetime displaced into unfamiliar configurations. A doorway now opening upon sky where once it led to a chapel, a flight of steps ending in empty air where once they descended to a courtyard. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes no longer, the harbor of Ragusa invisible from here, but surely afflicted by the same collapse, the same drowning of vessels by tsunamis that accompany such seismic events. The disaster occurred during a period of general Mediterranean economic decline, and the destruction of this morning will compound that decline for this particular republic, will accelerate the processes of marginalization that have already begun to erode its commercial primacy. The fire spreads with terrible efficiency through the wreckage, consuming the archives and many of the city's most precious records. You can see the glow of it from your position in what was once the main square, the heat pressing against your face even at this distance, drying the dust upon your skin to a crust that itches and cracks. The Republic's independence survived the disaster, though the state was weakened, and even now, in this first hour of catastrophe, the instinct for governance asserts itself among those who remain capable of organized thought. The sight of survivors gathering in the ruined main square establishes the first temporary governance. Men and women who knew each other in the old order, now improvising the new upon the unstable ground of the present. The taste of stale water from broken cisterns reaches you later, shared among survivors who have dug into the rubble to find the great underground reservoirs that collected the rain. You are standing at the harbor, though dawn belongs to another day now, the cycle of hours having passed through this destruction and emerged into a twilight of continuous emergency. The water, when it comes, carries the flavor of its interrupted storage, the slight stagnation of cisterns breached by falling stone, the mineral accumulation of years now released into cups and palms, and whatever vessels the survivors can improvise. The rebuilding generation will leave their mark on every street and building of the present old city, but that generation must first survive, must first drink this compromised water and breathe this dust-thickened air, and find some shelter among the ruins that will not collapse in the aftershocks. The loss of population staggers the imagination. An estimated 3,000 to 5,000 inhabitants dead in the space of a morning, the earthquake having struck when many were at church for Easter week observances, when the buildings were fullest and the expectation of harm furthest from any mind. You are standing near the space where the cathedral stood, the Romanesque structure now a mound of debris from which the occasional human limb protrudes, from which the sound of trapped and dying voices still emerges in the hours after the main shock. Many noble families were wiped out, forcing a slight opening of the closed aristocratic system, the rigid hierarchy of Ragusa's governance suddenly porous, where entire lineages had been extinguished in the collapse of their palazzi. The reconstruction efforts were hampered by this loss of population and destruction of archives, the memory of the city scattered with its stones, the genealogies and property records and diplomatic correspondence reduced to ash in the fires that followed the tremors. Foreign aid was sought from multiple European powers, though assistance was limited. The great states of the continent occupied with their own rivalries and their own interpretations of obligation. You are moving through the ruined city as the days pass, the unnatural stillness slowly yielding to the sounds of recovery and grief, the distant cries now more purposeful, the rumble of aftershocks gradually diminishing in frequency, if not in their power to terrify when they do come. The smell of dust and lime hangs in the air for days, and you carry it with you into whatever temporary shelter you have found, the taste of it mingling with the stale water that remains the principal sustenance of the survivors. The hours since have expanded into an eternity of labor and mourning, the Easter week observances forgotten in the more pressing ritual of staying alive. The rector's palace becomes one center of this improvised survival, its surviving chamber serving as council rooms where the remnant of government attempts to assess the extent of catastrophe. You are standing in the damaged loggia, the sky visible through cracks in the vaulted ceiling, the wind moving through spaces never designed to receive it. Around you, the surviving nobles and officials gather to debate what can be done. their voices hushed by the scale of what they have witnessed, by the disappearance of familiar faces from these deliberations. The earthquake has accomplished what no foreign enemy could achieve across centuries of the Republic's independence, has reduced the proud city to a condition of absolute dependency upon the mercy of events and the slow accumulation of will to rebuild. The heat of fires burning out of control gradually diminishes as the fuel is consumed, as the flames find no more to destroy in the areas they have already claimed. You move through the streets where the smell of charred wood and heated stone has replaced the pure dust of the initial collapse, the texture of destruction layered now by its secondary consequences. The city was rebuilt in the unified Baroque style visible today, giving the old town its coherent appearance, but that rebuilding lies in the future, invisible from this moment of absolute ruin. What you see now is the possibility of that coherence emerging from chaos, the first intentions forming in minds that have not yet found the resources to realize them. The sound of pickaxes beginning the clearance reaches you across the ruined city in the weeks following, a rhythm more regular than the aftershocks that still occasionally interrupt it. You are standing near the space where the cathedral once rose in its Romanesque solidity, the mound of debris now being attacked by workers who have somehow found tools, who have organized themselves into shifts of labor that continue through the lengthening days of spring. The pickaxes strike stone that was laid centuries before, that was shaped by hands long dead into the blocks that formed walls and towers and the very paving beneath your feet. You can hear the first strokes of the rebuilding generations mark upon every street and building of the present old city, the deliberate, exhausted percussion of metal against limestone. The new cathedral was constructed between 1672 and 1713, taking over 4 decades to complete, but the foundation of that future structure must be laid upon the clearing of the present devastation. You are standing at the site as the debris gradually yields to organization, as the dead are recovered and honored, and the living begin to imagine forms that will replace what has been lost. The heat of the conflagration has long since passed, replaced by the ordinary warmth of Mediterranean spring, the sun striking the cleared ground with an innocence that seems almost mocking after what it has witnessed. Around you, the workers move with the slow certainty of those who have accepted that their labor will not be completed by their own hands, that the cathedral they clear space for will rise to its Baroque completion only when they have become the ancestors of its eventual finishers. The laying of the foundation stone for the new cathedral in 1672 symbolizes determined renewal, that ceremony marking 5 years of improvised survival and gradual consolidation. You are standing among the gathered survivors and their children, the taste of stale water now a memory replaced by the ordinary flavors of recovered normality, the cisterns repaired or replaced by the patient labor of those years. The Baroque style of the new foundation speaks a different architectural language than the Romanesque it replaces, the cathedral reborn in the aesthetic of a changed era, of a city that has passed through destruction and emerged with a vision of coherence that the old medieval accumulation could not have achieved. The great earthquake has become the defining event of a generation, the reference point against which all subsequent experience will be measured. The sound of pickaxes has given way to the more sophisticated rhythms of organized construction, the simple removal of debris succeeded by the measured placement of new stone upon prepared foundations. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, the harbor now functional again if diminished, the vessels riding at anchor in attitudes of restored purpose that mirror the restored animation of the city around them. The builders of this new phase have learned what they can from the failures of their predecessors, have designed foundations and walls that will flex where the old ones shattered, that will distribute the shock of future tremors across their surfaces rather than concentrating it at their weak points. You are moving through streets where the unified Baroque style is only gradually emerging. Individual buildings completed while their neighbors remain in ruins. The coherence of the final old town still an aspiration rather than an achieved fact. The unnatural stillness has been replaced by the ordinary sounds of a working city, the distant cries now only of commerce and daily life. The rumble of aftershocks faded into the geological memory of the region, to return perhaps in centuries hence when the present builders are themselves ancient history. You are standing near the rising walls of the new cathedral, the Baroque lines already visible in the prepared foundations, in the carved stones that will form its elevations. The foreign aid, though limited, has contributed what it could, the assistance manifest in particular donations of timber or coin or architectural expertise that the Republic could not itself supply. The earthquake destroyed the city, killing an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 inhabitants, and the absence of those thousands continues to shape the social fabric of the rebuilt Ragusa. You taste the ordinary water of restored cisterns, no longer stale with interruption, but clear and cool as before the catastrophe, the shared privation of the immediate aftermath, now a bond between those who survived it. The palace has been restored to its functions, its loggia rebuilt where it cracked and tilted, its chambers again receiving the deliberations of state. The cathedral, originally Romanesque, was ruined and later rebuilt in Baroque style, and the construction between 1672 and 1713 occupies the remaining productive years of those who laid its first stones. You are standing at the ceremony of foundation, the heat of the conflagration, now 5 years past, replaced by the warmth of ceremonial torches and the gathered bodies of the congregation. The child who witnesses this foundation will be middle-aged when the final vault is closed, will perhaps bring grandchildren to see the completed work that their own parents helped to build. The rebuilding generation left their mark on every street and building of the present old city, and that mark is visible first here, in the deliberate placement of this foundation, stone upon the cleared ground where the Romanesque once stood. The sound of pickaxes has long since faded, succeeded by the more complex orchestration of Baroque construction, the specialized trades of sculptors and stucco workers and painters who will ornament the interior when the shell is complete. You are standing in the completed nave, though this vision belongs to the future beyond your present witnessing, the space bright with the light that falls through the planned windows, the air carrying the scent of new plaster and fresh pigment. The earthquake struck Ragusa when many were at church for Easter week observances, and the church that rose from that destruction would be different in style and spirit, would speak of resilience and transformation rather than the medieval stability that had preceded it. You are moving through the streets of the present old town, the Baroque coherence fully achieved now, the limestone warmed by centuries of subsequent foot traffic, the harbour below receiving vessels that no longer carry the cargoes of a great power, but still connect this place to the wider world. The buildings that surround you have been designed with knowledge of that estimated magnitude 7. 0 or greater have been tested by subsequent tremors across the centuries and found sufficient to their challenge. The taste of stale water from broken cisterns, shared among survivors, has passed into the oral memory of families, into the stories told of the great-grandparents' generation and the trials they endured. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, the cold air moving across your face, the vessels riding at anchor in attitudes of ordinary purpose, their masts swaying in the offshore breeze that has blown across this coast since before the city existed and will continue after it has become once again ruins. The reconstruction efforts were hampered by the loss of population and destruction of archives, and the lacunae in the historical record, the uncertainties about particular genealogies and property boundaries, are themselves memorials to the morning when the earth shook and the buildings fell, and the accumulated memory of centuries was scattered into dust and flame. You are standing in its finished space, the Baroque vaults rising above you in the confident curves of a style that knows its own adequacy, that has answered the challenge of destruction with the assertion of new form. The disaster struck at approximately 8:00 in the morning, when many were at church for Easter week observances, and the bells that called them to destruction would ring again over the rebuilt city, would mark the hours of the new cathedral's existence as they had marked the old. You hear them now, the sound carrying across the unified Baroque style visible today, the coherent old town that the rebuilding generation created from the absolute chaos of that Easter morning. The strongest documented earthquake in Dalmatian history struck Ragusa on April 6, 1667, and the city that surrounds you in its present form is the answer to that striking, the deliberate, patient, generational response of a people who refused to abandon their place upon this coast, who found in destruction the occasion for renewal, who left upon every street and building the mark of their determination to begin again. The pale winter light of the Adriatic filters through the tall windows of the council chamber in early 1416, falling across the stone floor in thin, clear bands that reach toward the raised platform where the senators gather. You are standing near the eastern wall, where the morning air retains the coolness of the night just past, and around you the murmur of prepared speeches rises and settles like breath held before a long exhale. The Republic of Ragusa, this small maritime state perched upon the Dalmatian coast, has assembled its governing councils in the palace that overlooks the harbour, and the matter before them will alter the character of Ragusan commerce for centuries to follow. The proposal for abolition is read aloud in the measured cadences of official Latin, the language of law and record in this republic that trades in words as carefully as it trades in goods. A scribe stands ready with ink and prepared parchment, for what is spoken here must be fixed in writing before the sun completes its traverse of the winter sky. The text before the council calls for an end to the trade in Christian slaves, a commerce that has supplied labor for domestic service and galley rowing, a traffic that has passed through Ragusan hands in modest measure because of the Republic's position on the Adriatic. The reader's voice carries the weight of each clause, and you notice how the cool air seems to still further as the implications unfold. The senators of Ragusa have not gathered under pressure from crowds or petitioners, for this decision emerges from the Republic's governing councils rather than popular pressure. The men seated upon the benches represent merchant families whose vessels have carried human cargo alongside olive oil and Dalmatian wine, whose houses have been served by bondsmen purchased in eastern markets. Yet the document before them argues that Ragusa's position on the Adriatic, which has made it a minor participant in Mediterranean slave trading, need not condemn it to perpetuate that participation indefinitely. The pale and clear quality of winter light moves slowly across the assembled faces, touching the fur collars of winter robes, catching the silver of a chain of office. The debate proceeds through the hours of that morning, and you are standing at the periphery of the chamber as arguments for and against the measure rise and fall in the cool air. Some speakers recall the practical necessity of galley labor, the difficulty of finding free men willing to endure the oar's brutal rhythm. Others speak of the Republic's relationships with Orthodox and Catholic neighbors, of the wisdom in maintaining good relations with powers whose subjects have too often filled the slave markets of the Eastern Mediterranean. The humanitarian concerns that accompany these diplomatic calculations are expressed in the restrained vocabulary of 15th century statecraft, yet they are present nonetheless, moving beneath the surface of legal argument like currents beneath a calm sea. The Great Seal of Ragusa awaits upon its cushion, the instrument by which the Republic transforms deliberation into binding law, and its weight will soon be affixed to the abolition document that rests upon the clerk's table. You can see the seal from where you stand near the eastern wall, its metal surface catching the pale winter light in brief, intermittent gleams as bodies shift and the morning advances. The chamber has grown warmer now from the press of assembled men, though the cool air still reaches you in occasional drafts from the windows, reminders of the season outside. The vote in the Grand Council proceeds by customary form, each member rising in turn to declare his position, and the scribe records each assent and each dissent in the Republic's official Latin. You are watching this process from your place near the wall, and around you the tension of decision gradually releases into the particular quiet of conclusion. The majority is sufficient, the measure carries, and Ragusa becomes one of the earliest European states to formally abolish the slave trade, a distinction achieved in 1416, decades before most other European jurisdictions acted. The significance of this moment is not lost upon those present, though they express it in the formal gratitude to divine providence that closes such sessions, in the restrained exchange of recognition among men who have altered the course of their republic. A palace corridor after the decisive vote, momentarily empty of officials, greets you as you move from the chamber toward the outer stairs. The pale and clear quality of winter light now fills this passage from a window at its end, and your footsteps upon the stone seem loud in the absence of voices. Somewhere ahead, the preparations for public proclamation are already beginning, for law in Ragusa derives its force not merely from council deliberation, but from the voice of herald reading to assembled citizens. The abolition occurred in 1416, and the document that embodies it must now journey from the hands of scribes to the ears of the people. The Great Seal being affixed to the abolition document requires the presence of witnesses, and you find yourself among those who observe this final formal act in an interior chamber where candles supplement the declining winter daylight. The weight of the seal presses the wax into the parchment with a soft but decisive sound, a physical punctuation to the legal sentences just composed. The arms of Ragusa emerge in relief, the figure of Saint Blaise who protects this city, the fortifications that represent its determined independence. Around you, the merchants who have traded in many commodities, including human flesh, now observe the instrument that will prohibit them from transporting slaves on their vessels, that will subject violations of the prohibition to fines and confiscation of property. The public proclamation of the new law occurs from the palace steps as the afternoon advances, and you are standing among the assembled crowd in the square as the herald unfolds his text. The murmur of the crowd rises initially from the ordinary business of a winter marketplace, the exchange of greetings and negotiations that fill such spaces, then gradually stills as the familiar formula of opening draws attention to the unexpected substance of what follows. The herald's voice carries across the stones, and the words in their official Latin are then rendered in the Dalmatian dialect for those whose commerce has not required the learned tongue. The 1416 prohibition applied specifically to the trade in Christian slaves, though the implications of this restriction will extend in practice to challenge the broader commerce in human beings. The pale winter light has shifted to afternoon gold as the proclamation concludes, and you notice how the crowd receives this news with the particular restraint of a commercial people, measuring the practical consequences even as they acknowledge the formal grandeur of the act. Some faces show relief, others calculation, for the slave trade had previously supplied labor for domestic service and galley rowing, and substitutes must now be found. Yet there is also present, among the listeners, a recognition that the Republic's limited involvement in slavery made abolition economically feasible, that Ragusa's modest participation in this traffic allows it to depart without the catastrophic disruption that would attend such withdrawal in larger slave-trading powers. The square gradually empties as the herald rolls his document, and the afternoon cold intensifies, and you remain for a moment upon the steps, observing how the pale and clear quality of winter light now touches the eastern facades of surrounding buildings with a faint rose that precedes evening. The decision was consistent with Ragusa's image as a civilized commercial republic. This self-conception that has guided its diplomacy and its law through centuries of Adriatic rivalry. The Republic of Ragusa, small and exposed, has found in moral distinction a form of power, in early ethical commitment a marker of status among the competing states of the Mediterranean world. The days that follow bring the gradual release of existing slaves, some of whom remained as paid servants, and you observe this transition in the households of the city where bonds of service replace bonds of ownership. A woman who had prepared meals in a merchant's kitchen now receives wages for the same labor, and the rhythm of domestic life adjusts to this new formality. The former galley slaves present greater difficulty, for the oar's brutal rhythm is not easily endured by free men with alternatives, yet the Republic's fleet finds ways to recruit through payment and the promise of eventual citizenship. The cool air of that January morning seems distant now as spring approaches, yet the consequences of that morning's decision continue to unfold in these practical arrangements. The ban was periodically renewed and reinforced by subsequent legislation, and you are present in later years when the councils return to this matter, clarifying penalties, extending protections, responding to the persistence of Mediterranean slavery in neighboring states where the trade continues despite Ragusan example. The silence of a palace corridor after the decisive vote becomes a familiar sensation as you attend these later sessions, each renewal confirming the original commitment of 1416. The Republic's position on the Adriatic, which had made it a minor participant in Mediterranean slave trading, now makes it a minor but persistent voice against the continuation of that trade by others. The weight of the seal being affixed to each renewal document recalls the original moment, and you observe how the ceremony acquires through repetition something of ritual significance, the physical act of sealing connecting present legislators to their predecessors of earlier generations. The pale winter light falls upon these later ceremonies as it fell upon the first, a continuity of atmosphere that matches the continuity of legal purpose. Ragusa's early abolition is sometimes cited in modern Croatian historical narratives as evidence of progressive traditions, and though such retrospective interpretation would puzzle the practical merchants who made this decision, the lineage of commitment is not entirely fictitious. The centuries pass in the manner of such histories, and you observe how the 1416 Act preceded by centuries the more famous abolitions of the 18th and 19th centuries, how Ragusan example remained known to later reformers even when it could not persuade the greater powers to earlier action. The murmur of the crowd in the square becomes a memory preserved in chronicle, the voices of 1416 echoing in the texts that later abolitionists consult as they build their cases against the revived and expanded slave trades of Atlantic modernity. The 1416 prohibition represents one of the first legislative acts against human trafficking in European history, and this priority, though limited in immediate effect, establishes a precedent that accumulates moral force across the years. The Republic of Ragusa endures, and you are standing in later decades upon the harbour where the decision of 1416 first took practical effect upon the vessels that load and unload. The pale and clear quality of winter light still falls upon this scene, unchanged in its physical character, though the world it illuminates has transformed repeatedly. The abolition occurred in 1416, decades before most other European jurisdictions acted, and this priority remains part of the Republic's self-understanding, its claim to civilized status among the powers that surround it. The cool morning air of that January chamber is long past, yet the documents sealed in that atmosphere continue to bind, to define, to represent. The Mediterranean slavery that persisted in neighboring states gradually diminishes over the centuries, not through Ragusan influence alone, but through the complex of economic and moral changes that reshape European civilization. Yet the early commitment of this small republic retains its place in that larger narrative, a first step taken when the path was not yet clear, maintained through the periodic renewals that kept it active in law. You are standing finally in a later century, observing how the Republic's position on the Adriatic continues to shape its destiny, how the decisions of 1416 have become part of the foundation upon which subsequent Ragusan identity is constructed. The murmur of the crowd has long faded, yet the text of that proclamation survives in archive, its official Latin still legible upon the parchment that bears the Great Seal's impression. The weight of the seal established a physical trace of commitment, a material connection between intention and obligation that subsequent legislation repeatedly reaffirmed. The gradual release of existing slaves, some of whom remained as paid servants, established patterns of labor transition that recurred in later abolitions elsewhere. The practical problem of moving from bondage to freedom that Ragusa addressed in modest scale before the greater test of Atlantic emancipation. The humanitarian concerns and the Republic's desire to maintain good relations with Orthodox and Catholic neighbors that motivated the original decision proved durable in their conjunction, each reinforcing the other across the years of renewal and reinforcement. The decision emerged from the Republic's governing councils rather than popular pressure, and this origin in deliberative process rather than mass mobilization gave it a particular character, restrained and practical, yet no less consequential for its measured form. The pale winter light of the Adriatic, pale and clear, falls upon the conclusion of this history as it fell upon its beginning, and you are present in this illumination as witness to what time has preserved and what it has transformed. Ragusa became one of the earliest European states to formally abolish the slave trade, and this fact, established in the council chamber of 1416, continues to mark the Republic's place in the longer story of human freedom's gradual expansion. The cool morning air of that January chamber has long since dispersed, yet the document sealed in that atmosphere remains, its words still binding, its example still available to those who seek in history the precedents for their own commitments. The harbour stretches before you in this final light, the Adriatic waters holding the pale reflection of a sky that clears as winter advances toward its turning. The Republic of Ragusa, small upon this coast, has made its mark through this early decision, has established through the deliberations of 1416 a claim upon the attention of later centuries. The abolition occurred in 1416, and you are standing at the edge of that occurrence and its consequences, feeling upon your face the particular quality of winter light in the Adriatic, pale and clear, that has witnessed this history from its beginning and will continue to witness what follows, the long unfolding of decisions made in council chambers, sealed with weighty instruments, proclaimed to waiting crowds, and gradually woven into the fabric of a people's memory of themselves. You are standing in the archive chamber of the rector's palace, where morning light falls through tall windows onto rows of leather-bound volumes containing the accumulated correspondence of centuries. The smell of sealing wax lingers here, that particular resinous warmth that accompanies the final moments of diplomatic preparation, when documents are closed against the world and entrusted to waiting couriers. Around you, shelves rise toward vaulted ceilings, each spine marked with the name of a city where Ragusa maintained permanent representation. Over a dozen European and Ottoman capitals, each volume a thread in the vast web of negotiation that has sustained this small republic against the pressures of empires. You run your fingers along the bindings, feeling the slight irregularities of hand-tooled leather, the raised bands that speak of craftsmen long departed from the world whose affairs they helped record. The preparation of an ambassador's instructions begins many weeks before departure, a process of consultation and careful drafting that draws upon accumulated wisdom. You are present in the council chamber, where 6 senators lean over a table scattered with maps and previous correspondence, their voices low and deliberate as they consider the precise formulation of each phrase. The Republic's diplomatic correspondence fills thousands of volumes in the Croatian state archives, and the men before you are conscious that their words will join this accumulation, will be read and weighed by successors who will judge whether they serve the Republic's interests with sufficient care. A draft is read aloud, its periods long and balanced, its recommendations hedged with qualifications that acknowledge uncertainty without surrendering to it. The Republic's tiny size made military defense impossible. Survival depended entirely upon negotiation, and every instruction must embed this understanding, must arm the ambassador with arguments rather than soldiers, with patience rather than force. Through the open windows, you hear the rhythmic sound of a courier's horse on the coastal road north from the city, a messenger departing with papers whose contents have been debated for days. The sound diminishes gradually, absorbed into the larger silence of the Adriatic morning, and you turn back to observe the final sealing of the pouch, the ambassador's credentials folded within their protective covering, the wax impressed with the Republic's seal while it still holds sufficient heat to receive the mark. The taste of preserved figs and almonds, standard provisions for long diplomatic journeys, awaits in the antechamber, packed with the practical care that accompanies all Ragusan enterprise, the sweet, dense nourishment that will sustain a traveler through mountain passes and uncertain inns. You find yourself transported to a Vienna palace in the depth of winter, where a Ragusan delegation has been engaged in tense overnight negotiation as Ragusan independence hangs in the balance. The particular hush of a foreign embassy chapel, where Ragusan diplomats hear mass in exile, seems to have extended itself into the negotiating chamber itself, a quality of stillness that permits concentration upon matters of extreme delicacy. Candles gutter in silver holders, their light casting uncertain shadows across faces that have grown pale with fatigue and the strain of maintaining diplomatic composure through hours of argument and counter-argument. The Republic's currency, the purpura, was accepted in trade across the Mediterranean, but here in this northern chamber, the true coin is information, the careful deployment of knowledge about other powers' intentions, about the shifting alignments that threaten to engulf the small state whose fate these men have been charged to protect. Diplomatic immunity was carefully protected, with harsh penalties for violence against ambassadors, yet this protection extends only to physical harm. The psychological pressure of isolation, of being made to wait in antechambers while greater powers determine one's future, no treaty can prevent. The night wears on, and you observe the Ragusan ambassador requesting yet another adjournment, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that shows in the careful movements with which he replenishes his ink. Ragusan law was codified in the 15th century, providing a stable legal framework for commerce, and the ambassador draws upon this heritage now, citing precedents of Ragusan independence that stretch back across generations, constructing an argument for continuity that stands against the revolutionary disruption surrounding him. The city survived the War of the Spanish Succession through careful non-alignment, and the ambassador's instructions, drawn from the archives, counsel him towards similar evasion now, toward commitments sufficiently vague to permit subsequent interpretation, toward the cultivation of time as an ally against those who would force immediate decision. Dawn finds the negotiations suspended, the Austrian delegates having withdrawn to consult with their principals. The Ragusan ambassador permitted at last the relief of the chapel whose hush you have already encountered, the particular stillness of displaced worship, where candles burn before an altar that is not one's own, where the familiar words of the Mass rise in an accent that marks the worshipper as stranger. You stand at the chapel's rear, feeling the cold of the stone floor through your soles, watching the ambassador's bowed shoulders as he kneels in the grey morning light that filters through windows glazed with the arms of forgotten benefactors. The smell of sealing wax seems to have followed him here, a trace upon the leather case that contains his remaining documents, the credentials that may yet prove insufficient to the demands of the present crisis. You are standing at a harbour when news arrives that another European power has recognized the Republic's neutrality, a packet carried by the same rhythmic horse that departed weeks before, the sound now returning, transformed into message. The visual impression of the Republic's small size, seen from a departing ship, diminishing against the coastline, will be this ambassador's experience if he succeeds, the gradual reduction of land to line to memory as the vessel carries him toward new appointment or toward home. But for now the ship has arrived, and the news it carries spreads through assembled merchants and officials with a rapidity that belies the deliberation of its making. Ragusan passports were respected across Europe, facilitating travel for merchants and scholars, and the recognition of neutrality extends this respect to the collective body of the state itself, acknowledging what the Republic has long claimed, that its existence serves the interests of commerce and communication among greater powers, that its elimination would cost more than its maintenance. The harbour air carries salt and the particular iodine sharpness of drying seaweed, and you observe the ambassador's secretary copying the recognition into the official register, his hand moving with the steady pace of one who has performed this action many times before, who knows that the words he transcribes will be consulted by successors seeking precedent and assurance. Diplomatic gifts were carefully calibrated to reflect status without causing offense, and you notice upon the secretary's desk a small casket that awaits dispatch, its contents, perhaps coral, perhaps silver filigree, selected to acknowledge the recognition without implying obligation beyond what the Republic can sustain. Consular officials were maintained in major ports to assist Ragusan citizens abroad, and the news of neutrality will be relayed through this network, will reach merchants in Venice and Constantinople and Barcelona, will reassure them that the documents they carry retain their protective power, that the Republic's slender reach still extends to shelter them. The Republic's survival through the Renaissance and Reformation, despite its Catholic identity, demonstrated diplomatic flexibility, and you find yourself in a later century now, observing the gradual realization in the late 18th century that the old system of balances is failing. The council chamber is the same, or similar, its windows perhaps replaced, its senators wearing different dress, But the quality of deliberation has altered, become more urgent, less confident in accumulated wisdom. The city hosted negotiations between other powers, serving as a neutral venue, yet the neutrality itself has grown precarious. The great powers less willing to respect the small states' independence when their own conflicts escalate toward total commitment. You are standing at the window, observing the harbor that has been the source of Ragusan wealth, noting the diminished traffic, the fewer ships flying the Republic's flag, the gradual encroachment of vessels from greater states whose merchants no longer require Ragusan intermediation. The 18th century saw gradual economic stagnation as the city's commercial role diminished, and this material decline undermines the diplomatic position that material prosperity once sustained. The senators discussed diminished revenues, the difficulty of maintaining embassies whose cost once seemed modest against the flow of trade, the impossibility of preserving the appearance of substance when substance itself has thinned. The smell of sealing wax persists, for documents must still be closed and dispatched, but the pouches grow fewer, the destinations more limited, the instructions more defensive in their aspirations. The rhythmic sound of a courier's horse on the coastal road north from the city continues, but less frequently, and you strain to catch it against the other sounds of a port city contracting upon itself, the reduced calls of gulls, the quieter waterfront. You are present when the final diplomatic mission is dispatched to Paris as French armies approach the Adriatic, the last attempt to preserve through negotiation what force cannot defend. The ambassador is younger than his predecessors, or appears so, perhaps because the gravity of his task has not yet settled upon his features, perhaps because the Republic no longer commands the service of its most experienced men, who have found other employments in a world that offers little reward for loyalty to diminishing causes. The taste of preserved figs and almonds is prepared with the same care as always, packed with the same attention to the needs of travel, yet you sense in this preparation an element of finality, the possibility that this journey will not be followed by return. Ragusan neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars ultimately proved impossible to sustain, and the ambassador carries instructions that acknowledge this impossibility even as they seek to delay its consequences, that instruct him to obtain terms rather than preserve independence, to secure survival in some reduced form rather than perish in defense of the whole. You are standing at the harbor as his ship prepares to depart, observing the limestone walls and terracotta roofs that have contained this experiment in self-governance across 5 centuries of European upheaval. The coastline recedes, becomes a line, becomes a memory, and you remain upon the shore, feeling upon your face the particular quality of winter light in the Adriatic, pale and clear, that has witnessed this history from its beginning and will continue to witness what follows, the long unfolding of decisions made in council chambers, sealed with weighty instruments, proclaimed to waiting crowds, and gradually woven into the fabric of a people's memory of themselves, the archives waiting in their vaulted chambers for those who will come to read what was attempted, what was preserved, what was finally, through no failure of its own, surrendered to the larger movements that carry all small states toward absorption or extinction. You are standing in the upper gallery of the rector's palace as the autumn light of 1806 falls through tall windows in pale, oblique rectangles across the worn stone floor. The particular quality of autumn light on the old city, unchanged despite the political transformation, still touches the same surfaces it has warmed for centuries. The carved capitals, the faded frescoes, the heavy table where rectors have signed documents since the medieval age. Around you, the silence of the main square on the morning after the final surrender has not yet settled, for the surrender has not yet come, though everyone knows it approaches. The distant sound of the Adriatic, continuing its eternal rhythm against the rocks below the walls, reaches even here, a murmur beneath the more immediate sounds of boots and harness in the streets beyond the palace gates. The Republic of Ragusa was formally dissolved in 1808, ending over 4 centuries of independence. But the dissolution began in truth on this morning when French forces under Napoleon's General Auguste Marmont occupied the city in 1806 without resistance. You watch from the gallery as messengers arrive with news that the French had previously blockaded the Adriatic, isolating Ragusa from its traditional trading partners. And now the blockade has tightened into something more permanent, more suffocating. The harbour that once received merchants from Constantinople, from Venice, from the Levant, lies half empty, its quays untended, its warehouses growing hollow. The echo of French boots in the palace corridors, unfamiliar after centuries of softer Ragusan shoes, has not yet reached these upper chambers, but you can imagine it, can almost feel the vibration through the ancient walls as Marmont's soldiers establish their quarters in buildings that have known only Ragusan administration. A door opens below, and you see the last rector, Simone de Giorgi, moving through the lower hall with the measured pace of a man who understands that his office has already become ceremonial, already carries the weight of ending. Simone de Giorgi served until the French abolished his office, and in these months of transition, he has maintained the forms of republican dignity, while knowing that the substance drains away with each arriving dispatch from Paris. The smell of French military rations, alien to the local cuisine, drifts occasionally through the palace kitchens now, mingling with the familiar sense of olive oil and dried fish and the wild herbs that grow on the hills above the city. You descend the stairs, your hand moving along the same balustrade that generations of nobles have touched in their own processions between public duty and private reflection. The arrival of French troops at the city gates in 1806, their uniforms strange against the ancient walls, had occurred without ceremony, without the drama of siege or the rhetoric of defiance. The gates opened because there was no alternative that preserved either independence or existence, because the Republic of Ragusa, for all its proud history, had never maintained the military force that might resist a determined modern power. You are walking now through the side passages of the palace, where the light falls more dimly, where the stone retains a chill even in these mild autumn days. Autumn light reaches the small windows here in thin, watery streams that illuminate dust motes and the edges of ancient inscriptions. In the council chamber, the final meeting of the rector and his council, acknowledging that resistance is impossible, has assembled in the manner of countless earlier sessions, though the substance differs absolutely. You take your place among the seated figures, feeling the hard wood of the bench against your back, hearing the rustle of documents and the subdued clearing of throats. The echo of French boots in the palace corridors interrupts occasionally, a patrol passing, an officer seeking some official, the new rhythm imposed upon the old architecture. The French established the puppet kingdom of Italy and later the Illyrian provinces in Ragusa's territory, and already the administrative maps are being redrawn in Paris. Already the clerks are preparing the documents that will subsume this ancient republic into larger entities conceived by imperial ambition. The silence of the main square on the morning after the final surrender exists now only in anticipation, but you can feel it gathering, can sense the weight of unspoken acknowledgement that fills the council chamber. Simone de Giorgi speaks of the necessity of orderly transition, of preserving what can be preserved, of avoiding the violence that has consumed other states caught in the path of Napoleon's expansion. The dissolution occurred without battle, in marked contrast to the violent ends of many other states, and there is perhaps a kind of dignity in this, though dignity offers small consolation for extinction. You are standing at a window as the council disperses, watching the figures emerge into the square below, their movements slower than usual, as if the body of the Republic already feels the paralysis that will precede its death. The smell of French military rations reaches you more strongly now, carried on a shift in the breeze from the kitchens where imperial soldiers eat their unfamiliar bread and preserved meats. The distant sound of the Adriatic persists beneath all these surface changes, indifferent to the flags that fly above the harbour, indifferent to the names that appear on the documents signed in this palace. 2 years pass in the compressed manner of historical narration, though for those who lived through them, the days moved with the same measured slowness that all days possess. You are in the palace again, but the palace has changed, its corridors more frequently travelled by French officials, its archives growing thin as documents are selected for removal. The rector's palace ceased to be a seat of government, its archives reportedly removed or scattered, and you watch as wooden crates are assembled in the main hall, as clerks sort through centuries of deliberation, of treaties, of the mundane records of a small state's attempt to maintain its place among larger neighbours. The echo of French boots in the palace corridors has become the dominant sound now, no longer an interruption, but the established rhythm. The lowering of the Libertas flag from the palace mast, witnessed by a diminished crowd, occurs on a morning when the sky hangs low and grey over the city, when the Adriatic has withdrawn into a dull metallic calm. You are among the witnesses, though the crowd is smaller than such a moment would once have commanded, many citizens having already withdrawn from public spectacle, already begun the process of private accommodation to changed circumstances. Autumn light is absent today, replaced by this uniform grey that seems to offer no shadows, no relief of brightness. The flag descends slowly, handled by men who do not know its history, who have been instructed in the mechanics of this ritual without understanding its significance. Some Ragusan nobles collaborated with French administration, others withdrew into private life, and in the days following this ceremony, you observe both paths being taken. Through the narrow streets of the old city, you pass men who have accepted positions in the new bureaucracy, who reason that someone must administer, that disorder serves no one's interest, that the French presence, however unwelcome, is at least a presence that understands the forms of law. Others you encounter only in the privacy of their houses, in the walled gardens where they tend their citrus trees and their roses, where they read the books that recall a different order of things. The smell of French military rations has spread now into the public markets, where the soldiers purchase what they need, where the local economy adjusts to new demands and new currencies. The departure of French officials with key archives, transported by sea to Paris, occurs on a morning when the harbour shows more activity than it has in months, imperial vessels taking on cargo alongside the few remaining merchant ships. You stand at the quayside, watching the crates being swung aboard, hearing the commands in French that direct the labour, the shouts that carry across the water in a language that has become the language of authority here. The distant sound of the Adriatic seems almost loud in this moment, as if the sea itself protests the removal of these documents, these records of a maritime republic's long struggle for autonomy. The evening of 1808, as the last rector leaves the palace that had confined his predecessors for centuries, finds you in the upper gallery once more, where the autumn light has faded to a deep amber that touches only the highest surfaces, leaving the lower chambers in premature shadow. Simone de Giorgi moves through the spaces of his former authority with the slow steps of a man who is already becoming a memory, who understands that his departure completes a sequence that began with Marmont's arrival, that continued through 2 years of diminishing autonomy. The silence of the main square extends backward into this evening, a silence that anticipates what morning will confirm, that already holds within itself the emptiness of a space from which meaning has been removed. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 assigned Ragusa to the Habsburg monarchy, not restoring its independence, though this future lies beyond the immediate experience of this evening, belongs to a chapter that will be written by others. Yet you can feel the direction of things, can understand that Napoleon's arrangements, however imposed, will outlast his own fall, that the forces he set in motion will be channeled rather than reversed by the diplomats who gather in Vienna to reconstruct a continent. The city's incorporation into the Habsburg Empire completed a process shaped by earlier upheavals, including Napoleon's occupation, and the name Ragusa gradually yielded to Dubrovnik in official usage during the 19th century, a gradual shift that mirrors the slower transformations of identity that occur in populations long after their political forms have been altered. You follow Simone de Giorgi through the final chambers, past the empty niches where documents once rested, past the windows that now show only darkness, the harbor invisible, the sea become a sound without a visible source. The smell of French military rations has faded for this evening, replaced by the older sense of stone and candle wax and the slight mustiness that comes to buildings when their human occupancy diminishes. The former republic's territory became part of Dalmatia, a Habsburg crown land, and in the administrative terminology that prevailed, the specific identity of Ragusa was subsumed into larger geographical units, its history preserved partly in archives that had traveled to Paris and in the family memories of those who continued to inhabit these streets. The last generation of Ragusan nobles preserved their family traditions and archives through the 19th century, and as one imagines the final rector passing through the outer gate, there were boxes stored in attics, documents copied and recopied, stories told to children who never knew the Republic, but may have learned to feel its loss as a personal grief. The romantic nostalgia for the lost Republic influenced Croatian national awakening movements, and in this too there is a kind of afterlife, a translation of political memory into cultural aspiration that will serve different purposes in a different age. According to some historical accounts, the final session of the Grand Council in 1808 voted to surrender authority to French representatives, and this vote, however reluctant and compelled by circumstance, is often treated as a formal moment of ending, after which subsequent history proceeded as something other than republican. You remain in the palace after Simone de Giorgi has departed, standing in the darkness of the council chamber where the long table still extends its polished surface, where the chairs still wait in their accustomed places. The distant sound of the Adriatic persists through the night, audible even here in the enclosed spaces of the palace, a reminder of continuities that outlast political forms. The echo of French boots in the palace corridors will resume with dawn, will become the established sound of this place, as natural to its next generation of occupants as the softer sounds had been to those who preceded them. You move through the darkened passages toward the harbor side of the palace, where the air carries more strongly the salt presence of the sea. The smell of French military rations has been replaced in your immediate perception by the older, more fundamental sense of stone and water and the slight decay of autumn vegetation. The particular quality of autumn light will not return to this chamber until morning, but you can anticipate it, can hold in your mind the image of how it will fall, how it will continue to fall across the centuries, touching indifferently the surfaces that have witnessed endings and beginnings, the slow transitions that constitute the substance of historical change. The distant sound of the Adriatic accompanies your own departure from the palace, through gates that now stand unguarded in the manner of a building that has lost its significance, that has become merely another structure in a city of notable structures. The echo of French boots fades behind you as you descend toward the harbor, as you move through streets where the darkness conceals the changes that daylight will reveal. The silence of the main square extends into this night, into the quality of stillness that precedes the new arrangements, the new sounds, the new rhythms that will establish themselves gradually, almost imperceptibly, until they become the only reality that memory can retrieve. You stand at the harbor's edge, where the water moves with a slight phosphorescence against the stone, where the darkness of the sea meets the darkness of the sky in a line that only the experienced eye can locate. The particular quality of autumn light on the old city will not return for hours yet, but its eventual return is as certain as the continuance of the Republic was once certain, as the ending that has now occurred was once unimaginable. The distant sound of the Adriatic speaks of durations that exceed all political forms, that will persist when the French have departed, when the Habsburgs have in their turn yielded to other arrangements, when the name Ragusa gradually yields to Dubrovnik in official usage during the 19th century and beyond. The smell of French military rations has faded entirely now, replaced by the fundamental sense of harbor and sea, the slight oiliness of calm water, the mineral tang of wet stone. You remain at the water's edge as the night progresses, as the stars emerge in their slow patterns above the darkness of the Adriatic. The silence of the main square has become the silence of this harbor, this city, this moment of transition between what was and what will be, between the Republic of Ragusa that endured for over 4 centuries and the longer history that will proceed without it, that will find other forms, other names, other meanings in the spaces that Republic once occupied. The distant sound of the Adriatic persists through all these changes, indifferent to the flags and the documents and the names that humans assign to their arrangements. You remain at the harbor as the darkness begins to thin, as the first suggestion of dawn appears in the eastern sky, knowing that this moment of ending contains also the seeds of continuation, that the last rector's departure, the lowering of the Libertas flag, the removal of the archives to Paris, all these terminations will also become the materials from which subsequent memory will construct its understanding of what was attempted, what was preserved, what was finally, through no failure of its own, surrendered to the larger movements that carry all small states toward absorption or extinction.